Hey, welcome back, friend. Or maybe this is your first time finding your way here. Either way, you're exactly where you need to be right now. Get comfortable. Fix your pillow. Pull that blanket just a little closer. Because tonight, I want to take you somewhere you've probably never thought about before. And I promise, by the time we get there, you'll see the world just a little differently. Picture a door. Not a fancy one, just a plain wooden door inside a small house in a tiny European town hundreds of years ago. And behind that door, something incredible is happening. A new human life is entering the world. But here's the thing that stops me every single time I think about it. For most of human history, what happened behind that door was completely, totally, absolutely off limits to men. Not because nobody was curious, not because husbands didn't care, but because the room where babies were born was seen as a world entirely unto itself, a world that belonged only to women. And if you dared to cross that threshold without permission, you would be punished. We actually have court records to prove it. In 15th century Belgium, a man named Henny van Daan decided he couldn't wait. His wife was in labor. The house was full of women, and he did what any nervous husband might do. He crept behind the staircase and pressed his ear to the wall. He just wanted to listen. He got caught, and the court fined him 15 leaves, a large sum back then, for the crime of eavesdropping on his own wife giving birth. The official record states, and I love this wording, that what he did was something that, quote, did not befit a man. Think about that for a second. In a world where men made nearly every rule, controlled nearly every space, and held nearly every kind of power, the one room they were not allowed to enter was the room where life itself began. Now, before we go any further, if this kind of story is the thing that keeps you up at night in the best possible way, do me a small favor. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves history. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a wonderful time to do that. But only if you're genuinely enjoying what we're building here together. And I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching this right now? Are you in bed with your phone propped up on the pillow? Maybe curled up on the couch with something warm to drink? Drop it in the comments. I read them, and I love knowing where these stories travel to. Now, turn the lights down just a little lower. Let the room get quiet, and let's step through that forbidden door together. For thousands of years, across almost every culture on Earth, the birthing room was an exclusively female space. Not by accident, not by oversight, but by deep, deliberate, collective agreement. When a woman went into labor, the men of the household would step outside. The husband might pace in the yard. He might go to a neighbor's home. In 17th century England, records show that when labor began, the husband would walk door to door through the village, knocking and calling for the women. The midwife, the neighbors, the friends to come. He gathered the help, and then he left. His job was done. What happened next was not his world. Inside that room, something remarkable was taking place. The space was prepared with a kind of quiet ceremony. Candles were lit. Extra linen was laid out. A birthing stool, a specially designed chair with a curved opening in the seat, was brought in. Herbs were set to warm. The windows were sometimes covered. The light softened, and the women who gathered were not just there to help with the physical work of birth. They were there as witnesses, as comfort, as memory keepers. These women, neighbors, relatives, close friends, were called by a word I find absolutely beautiful. They were called the gossips. Now, before you smile, and I know you are smiling, that word did not mean what it means today. In Middle English, the word gossip came from godsib, meaning a person spiritually related to you, a godparent, a trusted companion, someone bound to you by something deeper than blood. The gossips were the women who held your hand, the women who had been through it themselves, the women who stayed, and at the center of all of it stood one figure who carried more responsibility than perhaps anyone else in the entire village. The midwife. She was not simply a medical assistant. She was not simply a helper. The midwife was in many ways the most powerful woman in the community, and the most burdened. Consider what she was responsible for. She had to successfully guide the mother through one of the most dangerous experiences a human body can endure. She had to ensure the baby arrived safely. And if the baby showed any sign of weakness, if it seemed it might not survive the first minutes of life, she was authorized, and in fact required, to perform emergency baptism on the spot. In the Catholic world of medieval Europe, a soul that died without baptism could not enter heaven. The midwife was the person standing between a newborn soul and eternity. That is not a small thing. That is an enormous thing. And she was also, in a very real legal sense, a witness. The women gathered in the birthing room were the official witnesses to a birth. Who was born, what time, whether the baby arrived alive, whether the mother survived. In a world without birth certificates, without hospitals, without any of the bureaucratic infrastructure we take completely for granted, the memory of the gossips was the record. Their testimony in a court of law was considered valid, credible, and final. These women held the truth of every birth in their collective memory. Now, here is something that genuinely surprised me when I first came across it. We tend to assume, quite reasonably, that childbirth in the past was almost always a death sentence, that every pregnancy was a coin flip between life and tragedy. Ninth, while the risks were absolutely real, the picture is more nuanced than that dramatic assumption suggests. Research from Cambridge University, drawing on records spanning from 1550 to 1800, found that, for a married woman in that period, the lifetime risk of dying from childbirth was approximately 1 in 18. 1 in 18. Which sounds frightening, and it was, but it also means that 94% of married women did not die in childbirth. The vast majority survived, often through multiple pregnancies, often through remarkable hardship, but they survived. The risk was real, and the fear was real, and the courage required was extraordinary. But it was not the inevitable doom that popular imagination has sometimes painted it to be. What was universal, however, across every century, every country, every social class, was the knowledge that this moment required preparation. It required the right people in the room. It required ritual and prayer and the quiet strength of women who had walked this path before. In medieval England, some women carried with them what were called birthing girdles, long strips of cloth or parchment inscribed with prayers and sacred images, loaned out by local monasteries, wrapped gently around the mother's body during labor. They prayed to Saint Margaret, a figure whose story, when you hear it, makes a strange and beautiful kind of sense. Margaret, according to legend, had been swallowed whole by a dragon, and then emerged alive through the dragon's side, unharmed, holding a cross. For women facing the unknown of childbirth, she was the perfect patron. She knew what it was to fight her way out of something that should have killed her, and she survived. There is something I find deeply moving about all of this. Not the danger, though the danger was very real, but the community of it. The way women showed up for each other. The way an entire village organized itself around the needs of one woman in one room. In our world, we often give birth surrounded by machines and monitors and sterile walls and people we have only just met. That is not a criticism. Those things save lives, and we'll talk about exactly how in the chapters ahead. But there is something that was lost along the way, something about the circle of women, something about knowing that the people in the room with you had been through it themselves and had come back to stay, and with you, something about the gossip. And here is what I want you to hold on to as we move into the next part of tonight's story. The room we're about to walk into goes much, much deeper, because behind the candles and the prayers and the birthing stools, there was an entire world of knowledge, remedies, rituals, beliefs about the body that has mostly been forgotten. Some of it was wise beyond anything the doctors of the time could offer. Some of it was genuinely bizarre. But before any of it could begin, before the midwife was called, before the gossips gathered, before a single candle was lit in that forbidden room, there was a question that sounds almost too simple, and yet when you really sit with it, it opens up an entire world. How did a woman even know she was pregnant in the first place? The answer takes us from the banks of the Nile to the lecture halls of ancient Greece, to the strangest, most shadowy figures medieval Europe ever produced. People whose entire profession would make you laugh out loud until you realize they were onto something real. And I promise you, it is stranger and more human than you could possibly imagine. That is where we are headed north. Next, something has been sitting with me since we walked out of that birthing room together. We talked about the women who gathered, the midwife who stood at the center of it all, the candles and the prayers and the quiet courage of it. But there is a question that keeps pulling at me, one that sounds almost too simple. And yet, when you really sit with it, it opens up an entire world. How did a woman even know she was pregnant in the first place? Today you walk into a pharmacy, spend about $10, wait 3 minutes, and you have your answer. Clean, fast, certain. But for most of human history, certainty was a luxury no one had access to. And the lengths that people went to, the theories they believed, the tests they invented, the astonishing leaps of logic they made, tell us something profound about what it means to be human. Because here is the thing. The desire to know, to understand, to have some kind of answer in the face of the unknown. That desire is ancient, and it has always been with us. Let's start in Egypt, around 1350 years before the Common Era. So, we're talking roughly 3,400 years ago. Egyptian physicians were already writing down pregnancy tests in their medical papieri. The instructions went something like this. A woman who suspected she might be carrying a child would urinate each day onto 2 separate bags of seeds, one containing wheat, one containing barley. If the barley sprouted first, she was told to expect a boy. If the wheat sprouted first, a girl. And if neither bag sprouted at all, she was not pregnant. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that is adorable and also completely made up. Except, and this is the part that genuinely surprised me when I first read about it, researchers in 1963 actually ran a laboratory test on this exact method, and they found that roughly 70% of the time, ovarian from pregnant women did cause the seeds to germinate faster. The Egyptians were onto something real. They didn't know why it worked. They didn't understand hormones or estrogen or any of the biology underneath it. But they observed a pattern across thousands of years, recorded it faithfully, and passed it down. That is not superstition. That is science in its earliest, most human form. Think about that for a moment. A woman crouching over a little bag of grain in a field along the Nile, thousands of years before anyone had heard of a laboratory, and she was running a pregnancy test that was more than half right. Now, while the Egyptians were peeing on barley, the ancient Greeks were taking a very different approach, and I want to be gentle here, because the Greeks gave us democracy and philosophy and the foundations of Western thought. But their understanding of the female body was, let me put this diplomatically, a work in progress. Hippocrates, the man we revere as the father of medicine, the man whose oath doctors still symbolically invoke today, believed that the womb was not a fixed organ. He believed it could move freely throughout the body. In the Hippocratic medical texts, written around the 4th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, the uterus is described almost like a living creature, inside a living creature, restless, hungry, willful. If a woman was not pregnant, not nursing, not regularly with a partner, the womb, according to this theory, would grow restless. It would begin to wander, and depending on where it traveled inside the body, it would cause different symptoms. If it moved toward the liver, sudden speechlessness and a bluish tint to the skin. If it pressed toward the heart, palpitations and panic. If it rose all the way to the throat, she might choke. She might lose her voice entirely. The word they used for these conditions, hysteria, from the Greek word hystra, meaning womb. Every single time in history that a woman was described as hysterical, dismissive, irrational, too emotional, unstable. The word itself was pointing back to this ancient belief that her womb was wandering, that her body was literally out of control from the inside. And the prescribed treatment: get married, get pregnant, give the womb what it wants, anchor it in place, and the symptoms will resolve. I want to pause here because this is not just a funny historical footnote. This belief that a woman's health, her emotions, her very sanity were governed entirely by her reproductive organs shaped how women were treated by medicine for centuries, 2,000 years, almost without interruption. Plato wrote about it. Galen repeated it. Medieval physicians built on it. The concept of hysteria was still being diagnosed and debated in the early 20th century. 2,000 years of medicine looking at half the human population and saying, we can't quite figure out what's penning in there, so let's just assume the problem is the womb. Does that make you feel any kind of way? Because it makes me feel quite a lot. But let's come back to the pregnancy test, because the Greeks had one that is, I genuinely don't know how to introduce this, creative. Hippocrates proposed that if a woman wanted to know whether she was carrying a child, she should insert an onion into her body overnight. The theory was this: if she was not pregnant, the womb was open, like a passage, a tunnel, a wind channel through the body. And so by morning the scent would have traveled all the way up, and she would breathe out the distinct perfume of onion. If she was pregnant, the womb was sealed, closed, protected around a growing life. No pathway, no scent. If her breath in the morning smelled like onion, not pregnant. If it did not, she probably was. And here is the genuinely interesting thing beyond the obvious comedy of it. The logic is completely coherent. The problem is not that the Greeks were foolish. The problem is that the premise, the idea of the womb as an open passage connecting directly to the breath, was simply wrong. They hadn't yet been able to study anatomy directly. They were reasoning beautifully from a false starting point. And that is something that happens in science much more often than we like to admit. By the time we reached the Middle Ages and the early modern period in Europe, pregnancy detection had evolved, though not always in a direction we might call straightforwardly better. Enter the prophets. That's the actual name they were called. These were specialists, some of them trained physicians, some of them somewhere in the gray zone between medicine and showmanship, who claimed they could diagnose pregnancy and virtually any other condition simply by examining a woman's urine. They would hold the jar up to the light. They would observe the color, the clarity, the way it settled. According to one account from the period, pregnant urine had a very specific appearance, a clear, pale lemon color leaning toward off-white with a cloud upon its surface. Some of them went further and mixed the urine with wine, watching how the alcohol interacted with it. And here again, there is something interesting hiding beneath the theater of it. Because alcohol does react with proteins in urine, and pregnant women do have elevated levels of sirta in proteins. So the wine test may have actually produced observable results, even if the practitioners interpreting those results had no idea what they were actually seeing. There is a pattern here that I find fascinating. Again and again, across cultures and centuries, people were stumbling toward truth from the wrong direction. They got the answer right sometimes without understanding the mechanism. They observed real phenomena and wrapped them in explanations that were completely wrong. And it would take until the 20th century, until 1928, to be precise, before scientists finally identified the hormone that makes a pregnant woman's body chemically distinct from any other human. Chorionic gonadotropin, the hormone we now simply call HCG, the thing that turns the little line blue on the test strip. 3,000 years of human ingenuity, and the answer was in the urine all along. The Egyptians, with their barley seeds, had been pointing at it since 1350, before the Common Era. But here is what I find most affecting about all of this. Strip away the onions and the barley and the wine and the piss prophets and the wandering wombs. What you are left with is a picture of women navigating. aiding the most intimate, most uncertain moments of their bodies, largely without language that fit, largely without science that could help, and largely without physicians who genuinely understood what they were looking at. A woman in ancient Rome who felt the first nausea of early pregnancy would have had no word for morning sickness that we would recognize. She would have had no calendar of trimesters, no ultrasound to show her the small flickering heartbeat at 6 weeks. She would have felt something shifting inside her body, and she would have turned to the women around her, to the midwife, to her mother, to her neighbor who had been through it before, and she would have asked,
"Is this what I think it is?"
And the knowledge that came back to her was old, accumulated, passed hand to hand through generations, imperfect, and sometimes wrong, and sometimes accidentally right, but always human, always an attempt at connection, at understanding, at care. And that, I think, is what stays with me most about this chapter of history. Not the wrong theories, not the bizarre tests, but the fact that in every age, in every culture, in every corner of the world, women were trying to understand, what was happening inside their own bodies. And the world around them, the science, the medicine, the language, the official knowledge, was almost always 1 or 2 steps behind. Now, we've been sitting with the experience of not knowing, the uncertainty, before the knowledge arrived. But what happened once a woman did know she was carrying a child? What world was she stepping into? Because the person who was about to become the most important figure in her life, the woman who would guide her through everything that came next, had a story that is far more complicated, far more powerful, and far more extraordinary than history has generally given her credit for. We're about to meet her properly, and I promise you, the story of who she was, what she knew, and what was eventually done to her is one of the most quietly remarkable stories in all of human history. There is a woman I want you to meet. Her name is Louise Bourgeois, and if history had been kinder, or perhaps just more honest, her name would be as familiar to us today as any physician, any scientist, any figure we credit with advancing our understanding of the human body. She was born in 1563 near Paris into a middle-class family, the daughter of a builder. Not royalty, not a scholar, just a woman who ended up, through a combination of necessity, intelligence, and sheer persistence, becoming one of the most important figures in the history of childbirth. And she did it in a world that was doing everything it could to make sure she could not. Let me set the scene for you. The year is 1601. King Henry IV of France is 48 years old and has no legitimate heir. His new wife, Queen Mary de' Medici, the daughter of one of Italy's most powerful families, is pregnant with the child who could secure the French throne for a generation. The pressure is immense. The court is watching. The stakes, as they say, could not be higher. And into that room, that palace room crowded with aristocrats and courtiers and physicians, all jostling for position and credit, walks Louise Bourgeois. She is not there by accident. She maneuvered her way in through years of reputation, through careful cultivation of connections among the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, through the testimonials of physicians whose wives she had safely delivered. She had passed her licensing examination in 1598 before a panel of doctors, surgeons, ninth senior midwives. She had built a practice in Paris and assisted in the births of roughly 2,000 women before she ever set foot in a royal chamber. The king had originally favored a rival midwife, but Bourgeois won out, and on the 26th of September 1601, in the middle of a difficult birth, with an anxious king pacing nearby, Louise Bourgeois delivered the future Louis XIII. She would go on to deliver all 6 of Marie de' Medici's children. For each son she brought safely into the world, she was paid 500 crowns. For each daughter, 300. The average midwife of the time earned 50 crowns per delivery. Louise Bourgeois was earning 10 times that. But I want to be careful not to make this purely a story about success and triumph, because the full picture is more complicated and more human than that. In 1627, a princess under Bourgeois' care died 6 days after giving birth. The court physicians published an autopsy report that suggested Bourgeois was to blame. She was 64 years old. She had practiced for over 30 years. She had delivered the children of the most powerful family in France, and in the space of one published report, much of that reputation collapsed. She spent the final years of her life writing her own defense, arguing her case in print, refusing to be erased. I find that detail quietly devastating and quietly inspiring, because she kept writing even then. Now, Louise Bourgeois is remarkable, but she's also in many ways representative. Behind her story, behind the story of every historically known midwife, there are hundreds of thousands of women whose names we will never know. Women who learned not from books or medical schools, because those doors were largely closed to them, but from watching, from doing, from being handed the responsibility in the middle of the night when there was no one else. The typical path to becoming a midwife in medieval and early modern Europe was not a curriculum. It was not a certificate. It was an apprenticeship that began often in childhood, watching an older woman work, absorbing the rhythm of it, the language of it, the thousand small decisions that cannot be written down because they live in the hands and the eyes and the accumulated instinct of someone who has been in that room before. By the time a midwife was fully trusted by her community, she might have attended dozens of births as an observer before ever being the primary person responsible. She had seen the things that could go wrong. She had seen what helped, and she carried all of that forward. Here is something that I think gets genuinely lost when we look back at midwives through the lens of history. We tend to frame them sometimes as limited, as working with folk wisdom and superstition in the absence of real knowledge, as doing their best with what they had. But that framing underestimates something essential. The knowledge that midwives carried was experiential in a way that the formal medicine of the time was not. Let me say that again, because I think it matters. The male physicians who were increasingly trying to insert themselves into the birthing room in the 17th and 18th centuries, many of them had never actually witnessed a birth. They had studied anatomy from books, from diagrams, from cadavers. They had theoretical knowledge that was genuinely advanced in some ways, but they had not been in the room. Jane Sharp, the English midwife who published the first midwifery manual written by an English woman in 1671 after more than 30 years of practice, opened her book with a direct address. She called it "To the Midwives of England." She addressed them as sisters, and in that opening, she wrote something that I keep coming back to. She described the many women who had suffered, she said, in the hands of unskillful midwives, women practicing for money without proper knowledge of anatomy. And she wrote to correct that, to teach, to share what 30 years of being in the room had given her. She wrote it in plain English, not Latin, deliberately, because she wanted women to be able to read it. At a time when most medical texts were written in Latin by men for men, Jane Sharp chose the language of the women she served. That is not a small choice. That is a statement. Now, one thing I have not told you yet, and I think this is one of the most extraordinary facts about what a midwife was in the medieval and early modern world, is the scope of her legal authority. We touched on it briefly before, but I want to go deeper here. In a world without civil birth registration, without hospitals, without any of the bureaucratic infrastructure we now take completely for granted, the midwife was the legal witness to the most fundamental fact in a person's existence. Whether they were born alive, whether the mother survived, her testimony in a court of law carried weight that the testimony of almost no other woman could claim. In inheritance disputes, in questions of legitimacy, in cases where the identity of a child's father was contested, the midwife who had been in the room was called to speak, and she spoke with authority. But her power went even further than that. In the Catholic world of medieval Europe, and this is the part that still stops me whenever I think about it, the midwife was the only woman in Christendom who was authorized to perform a sacrament. If a newborn baby arrived in the world struggling for breath, blue, silent, clearly not going to survive its first minutes, The midwife did not wait for a priest. The priest was not in the room. The priest had never been in the room. She poured water. She said the words. She baptized that child. And in the theology of the time, she was the person who determined whether that soul went to heaven or was lost to limbo. The church recognized this. It trained midwives in the correct liturgy. It examined them on the words they needed to say. Inure. Berg, in the 16th century. City authorities actually printed up the baptism instructions and distributed them to every licensed midwife, binding each woman under oath to perform the rite correctly. Think about what that means. In a world where women were excluded from virtually every form of formal religious authority, where they could not be priests, could not preach, could not administer sacraments, midwives were quietly performing one of the most sacred acts in the entire Catholic tradition at the moment of greatest crisis, in the most intimate room in the world, without any man present to approve it. Does that strike you the way it strikes me? Because every time I come back to this fact, I find something new in it. And yet, here is the turn that history takes, and it is not a gentle one. This woman, this figure who held legal authority, religious authority, medical authority within her community, who was trusted with the lives of mothers and newborns, and in a theological sense with the fate of souls, had no guild. Unlike male craftsmen and physicians who organized themselves into guilds that protected their interests, regulated their practice, and gave them collective power. Midwives largely operated alone, and that left them vulnerable in a way that would matter enormously as the world changed around them. Beginning in the 15th century, something new started happening. Governments and churches began requiring that midwives obtain licenses. The first known formal licensing requirement appeared in Regensburg in 1452. England followed in 1512. On the surface, this sounds like recognition, like an elevation of status. But look at what the licensing actually required. In England, midwives swore oaths that bound them to, among other things, report information about the father of any child born out of wedlock, to refuse to help women in ways the church disapproved of, to never practice magic or sorcery, the magic clause. That one detail tells you everything about the tension that had always existed around the midwife. She was powerful, she was trusted, she was essential, and she was also, in the eyes of some authorities, dangerous. Because here is the shadow that falls across this entire history, and I cannot tell this story honestly without acknowledging it. The decades between roughly 1350 and 1650 in Europe were the height of the witch trials, and midwives were disproportionately targeted. Historians argue about exactly how disproportionate the picture is more nuanced than popular mythology suggests. Not every accused woman was a midwife. Not every midwife faced accusation. But the logic of suspicion was there, and it was explicit. A woman who dealt with the intimate mysteries of birth, who worked with herbs and remedies passed down through generations of women, who was present when babies died because babies died often despite everyone's best efforts, who had knowledge that she could not always explain in the rational language that male authorities demanded. She was, by the definition of suspicion in that era, exactly the kind of woman who attracted scrutiny. The Malleus Maleficarum, the Witch Hunter's Guide, published in 1486, described midwives as among the most dangerous practitioners of dark arts, able to harm or kill newborns in ways that would never be detected. It is a stunning accusation against the very women who were working, often in poverty, often for little or no payment, for the women who could not afford to pay, to keep mothers and children alive. And I think about that whenever I read accounts of midwives defending themselves in courts, or writing books to assert their expertise, or organizing whatever small forms of resistance were available to them. They were fighting always on multiple fronts. There is something I want to leave you with before we step into the next room of this story. When Jane Sharp sat down in 1671 to write her book after 30 years of practice, after seeing what she had seen, after watching male practitioners begin to claim authority over a space she had inhabited her whole professional life, She chose to address her readers as sisters, not as patients, not as clients, not as subjects. Sisters. That word carries an entire philosophy inside it. It says we are in this together. It says the knowledge I have belongs not to me alone, but to all of us. It says I am writing this down, so that it is not lost. And that impulse to preserve, to pass on, to refuse to let essential knowledge disappear, is exactly what carried midwifery forward through the centuries, through the witch trials, through the licensing laws, through the arrival of men with instruments and Latin degrees, who were in many cases learning from the very women they were displacing. Which brings us to a fascinating and somewhat uncomfortable question. What exactly were those folk remedies and practices that midwives carried for centuries? What was passed down in that circle of women by herb, technique by technique, generation by generation? Because some of it, a remarkable amount of it, turns out to have been genuinely ahead of its time, and some of it admittedly involved things like goose semen and animal organs, which makes the story a great deal more interesting. Right then, we ended on a rather dramatic promise: goose semen and animal organs, and I intend to keep it. But before we get to the genuinely bewildering end of the folk remedy spectrum, I want to start somewhere quieter, because the story of what midwives actually knew, what they carried in their hands and their memory across centuries, is not primarily a story of strange potions. It is, at its deepest level, a story about paying attention. Let me paint a picture for you. It is a cold night, somewhere in 17th century England or France or Germany. The exact country does not matter much for this particular moment. A woman is in labor. The room is warm and low lit. There are candles. There are women around the... And somewhere nearby there is a small pot of oil heating gently over the fire. Not just any oil, olive oil. The midwife dips a cloth into the warm oil and lays it carefully across the woman's belly. She fills a small animal bladder, essentially the hot water bottle of the ancient world, with warm oil and places it against the woman's side, and she stays close, not to perform a procedure, not to intervene, but to be there. This is documented in Roman medical texts from nearly 2,000 years ago. Soranus of Ephesus, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, described precisely this practice for midwives tending to women in labor. Warm oilcloths to the abdomen, gentle physical warmth, sustained presence. Now, the World Health Organization, in its current guidelines for care during childbirth specifically, recommends warm compresses and continuous labor support as evidence-based practices that reduce pain, shorten labor duration, and improve outcomes. 2,000 years apart. The same cloth, the same warmth, the same woman staying close. I think about that a lot. Here is what I find so striking about the folk medicine of the birthing room, when you look at it carefully, H. Honestly, without either romanticizing it or dismissing it. The remedies that worked, the ones that have survived long enough to be tested by modern science, almost all share a common logic. They were working with the body, not against it. They were trying to create the conditions under which a woman's body could do what it already knew how to do. Warmth to help muscles relax, specific herbs to strengthen or regulate contractions, emotional presence to reduce fear, and through that, reduce the physical tension that makes labor longer and more painful. That last one is not a small thing, and I want to spend a moment on it because it tends to get overlooked in historical accounts. Modern research, large, rigorous clinical studies, has consistently found that continuous support during labor from a person the woman knows and trusts meaningfully reduces the likelihood of difficult deliveries. It reduces the need for pain medication. It shortens labor. It improves outcomes for the baby. The word doula comes from the ancient Greek. It describes a woman who serves, who accompanies, who stays, and the practice it describes is as old as human birth itself. Every one of those women who gathered. In the birthing room, the gossips, the neighbors, the midwife, was providing something that we now understand has measurable physiological effects. Their presence mattered not just emotionally, but biologically. The women who came to sit and hold hands and whisper encouragement and stay through the night were doing something that modern medicine is in many ways only beginning to fully quantify. But now, let's talk about the parts that are harder to defend, because not everything in the birthing room was as clear-sighted as warm oil and trusted presence. There is a substance called ergot. Ergot is a fungus, a dark, hard growth that appears on rye and other grains when conditions are wet and cold. For much of European history, it was an accidental, terrifying contaminant that caused what people called St. Anthony's fire. Convulsions, gangrene, hallucinations, whole villages swept through by a kind of collective suffering that no one could explain. But somewhere along the way, and the first written record of this appears in 1582, midwives and healers noticed something. In very small, careful amounts, ergot caused the uterus to contract powerfully and quickly. So they began using it, no tea as a poison, but as a medicine. In 1697 in France, a pharmacist named Antoine Daoust de Paimpol received a letter from a midwife named Madame Dupil, who practiced in Chaumont-en-Vexin. She described how she and her mother before her had used ergot, about a thimbleful dissolved in water or wine or broth, when a labor was stalling and the uterine contractions were too weak. The result, she wrote, was a delivery within 15 minutes.
And you know what?
She was not wrong about the mechanism. She was not wrong that ergot caused uterine contractions. The problem was dosage. Without the ability to measure or standardize the amount of active compound in any given piece of fungus, the line between enough and too much was invisible. Doctors who began using it more aggressively in the early 1800s, convinced they were simply making use of an already proven remedy, ended up causing a surge in difficult deliveries. The medical community nicknamed it, darkly but accurately, pulvis ad mortem, the powder for death, rather than its original name, which had been pulvis ad partum, the powder for birth. The active compounds in ergot that cause uterine contractions were not properly isolated. Until 1932, when researchers finally extracted ergometrine under controlled laboratory conditions. Those compounds are still used in obstetrics today. When a woman gives birth in a modern hospital and there is concern about postpartum bleeding, the medication a nurse may administer to help the uterus contract is a direct pharmaceutical descendant of the knowledge that Madame Dupil and her mother carried in their hands. The midwives found the right answer 400 years before the scientists could explain why it worked. They just did not have the tools to use it safely. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I am genuinely curious what you think. How do you feel about that? About the gap between knowing something works and understanding it well enough to not cause harm? Because this is a tension that runs through the entire history of medicine, not just folk medicine, not just women's knowledge. Every era has its version of a treatment that was directionally correct, but dangerously imprecise. Bloodletting, mercury for syphilis, radical surgical procedures performed with more confidence than evidence. The folk practitioners in the birthing room were not uniquely ignorant or uniquely reckless. They were working at the edge of what was knowable, the way every healer in every period of history has had to do. The difference is that when their methods failed, they tended to be blamed in ways that male physicians of the same era simply were not. Now, on the subject of things that were also tried, but perhaps should not have been, I did promise you the goose semen. So, here we are. In ancient Rome, the natural philosopher, Pliny the Elder, recorded a remedy for difficult or slow labor that involved drinking water mixed with the secretions of a goose. This was not fringe folk medicine. Pliny's text, the Historia Naturalis, was one of the most widely read and referenced encyclopedias in the ancient world. He was a serious man documenting what he understood to be legitimate remedies, and the logic, if you stretch it far enough, follows a kind of internal consistency. Geese were associated with fertility. The substance in question was believed to carry the essence of new life. Therefore, consuming it might transfer that generative energy to a woman struggling to complete the work of birth. The logic is wrong. The biology is completely wrong. But the underlying intuition that there might be substances in the natural world that could help the body complete a difficult process was not wrong at all. They were groping toward something real with a goose. And then there are the remedies that I find most fascinating of all, the ones that sat right on the border between physical medicine and psychological medicine, in ways that their practitioners never quite articulated, but clearly understood intuitively. Think about the birthing girdles I mentioned earlier, those strips of cloth or parchment inscribed with prayers and sacred words, loaned by monasteries, wrapped around the bodies of laboring women. From a purely chemical standpoint, cloth does not reduce uterine discomfort. But from a psychological standpoint, a woman who believed deeply and sincerely that she was wrapped in something sacred, that the protection of a saint was literally touching her skin, was a woman whose nervous system was receiving a very different set of signals than one who felt alone and terrified. Fear tightens muscles. Calm allows them to work. We know this now with precision in terms of hormones and physiological mechanisms. The women in the medieval birthing room knew it in the form of prayer and cloth and the warmth of a familiar voice. They were doing something real. They were just calling it by a different name, red raspberry leaf. If you have ever been pregnant or known someone who was, there is a reasonable chance you have encountered this. Women have been drinking tea made from the leaves of the raspberry plant during pregnancy and in preparation for birth for centuries, possibly longer. It appears in European herbal traditions, in Native American medicinal practice, in folk remedy collections across multiple continents. The claim has always been that it strengthens the uterus, that it tones the muscle, that it makes contractions more efficient. For a very long time, this was treated by mainstream medicine as exactly the kind of charming but unverifiable folk belief that modern science had moved past. And then clinical researchers actually tested it. A study published in the late 1990s involving women who regularly consumed raspberry leaf preparations found shorter labor duration and a statistically meaningful reduction in the need for interventions during delivery. The mechanisms are still not perfectly understood, but the pattern that women observed across hundreds of years of accumulated experience turned out to point towards something real. They were not imagining it. They were documenting it in the only language available to them. The language of this worked for my mother and my grandmother's mother, and so I am telling you. And here is where I want to offer you something to sit with. We live in an era that is better at birth than any previous era in human history. The numbers are unambiguous on that. The technologies that protect mothers and newborns today have saved lives on a scale that would have seemed miraculous to any midwife of the 16th century. I am not romanticizing the past. I am not suggesting that warm oil and raspberry leaf tea should replace modern obstetric care. But something interesting happened when the formal medicalization of childbirth pushed folk knowledge aside. The historian John Riddle, writing about the lost botanical knowledge that was carried largely by women for thousands of years, described what happened as a broken chain of knowledge. The witch trials, the licensing laws, the systematic dismissal of women's experiential learning as superstition, all of it contributing, to the disappearance of a body of understanding that had been refined across countless generations, and some of what was lost we're still trying to recover. The modern doula movement, rooted in research showing that continuous labor support improves outcomes, is in many ways science rediscovering what the gossips already knew. The renewed clinical interest in warm water immersion during early labor is in many ways a return to what midwives always offered. The push for patient-centered birth environments, for dim lighting and familiar faces, and the permission to move freely during labor is a recognition that the carefully arranged, candle-lit birthing room of 500 years ago got some things deeply right. But here is something that I do not want to leave unexamined, because for every remedy that has been vindicated by modern research, there are others that did real harm, and the women who used them were not villains. They were not negligent. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge they had and the tools they had, in a world where hemorrhage after birth could kill a woman in minutes, where a labor that stalled had no surgical solution, where the line between helping and harming was not visible to anyone. The Argot story is the clearest example of this duality, a remedy that pointed at a real mechanism, that genuinely saved some lives by stopping bleeding that would otherwise have been fatal, but that also, when used without the ability to control dosage, caused deaths of a different kind. The knowledge was right. The precision was not there yet. And that gap between the right knowledge and the tools to apply it safely is exactly where so much of the tragedy of historical childbirth lived. Which brings us to a question that I find genuinely unsettling when I think about it too long. We have established over these hours together that the birthing room was a world of its own, a world of women's knowledge, women's authority, women's care. We have seen that some of what they knew was right. We have seen that some of what they knew was wrong, or right in principle, but dangerous in practice. And we have glimpsed the enormous, ancient weight of fear that sat alongside all of it, because all the herbs and all the prayers and all the warm oil in the world could not change one fundamental truth. For much of human history, birth was accompanied by a shadow. And understanding that shadow, its real dimensions, its real statistics, what it actually meant to live alongside that fear is what we are going to sit with next, because the numbers, when you look at them carefully and honestly, tell a story that is more complicated and in some ways more hopeful than you might expect. And in one very specific century, everything got dramatically, unexpectedly worse before it got better. That century is not the one you would guess. Something has been quietly waiting at the edge of our conversation this whole time. We have walked through the rituals, the remedies, the remarkable women who carried the knowledge of birth across centuries. And underlying all of it has been a question we've been circling without quite landing on directly. What did it actually feel like to live with the knowledge of what childbirth could cost? Not in the abstract, not in statistics, but in the body, in the chest, in the quiet hours before sleep. When a woman who was expecting a child lay in the dark and knew what she knew, the answer, I think, begins in prayer, and it begins much earlier than you might expect. Here is a detail I find quietly haunting in ancient Rome. There was a goddess named Vaticanus. His entire role in the divine order, his single specific purpose, was to open the mouth of a newborn baby so it could take its first breath and release its first cry. There was another called Levana, whose job was to lift the newborn from the ground, where it had been placed after birth, reconnecting it symbolically with the earth. There was Postverta, who governed breech births, babies who arrived in the wrong position. There was Dispater, an early form of Jupiter, who helped bring the child toward light, and presiding over all of them was Juno Lucina, whose name comes from the Latin word for light, lux, because her essential task was to bring the newborn from the darkness of the womb into the world. Think about that pantheon for a moment. The Romans built an entire mythology around the specific terrifying moments of birth, not just one goddess of fertility, not just one general deity you could petition for a good outcome, but a whole committee of divine figures, each responsible for a particular thing that could go wrong. A goddess for the first cry, one for the wrong position, one for the lifting. That is not theology born from serenity. That is theology born from fear. It is the kind of religious architecture that people build when they've looked at something closely enough to understand exactly which parts of it can break. And before Juno Lucina, before the Roman pantheon, there was the Greek goddess Eileithyia. She is one of the older figures in Greek mythology, daughter of Zeus and Hera, and her story contains something I cannot quite let go of. There is an ancient myth in which Hera, jealous and furious, orders Eileithyia to sit with her legs crossed outside the room where a woman is trying to give birth. The logic being, If the goddess of childbirth herself is physically bound, knotted, held closed, then the labor will not progress. The birth will be stopped for 9 days. According to the myth, this woman labors without delivering until a servant tricks Eileithyia into uncrossing her legs, and the birth happens immediately. Now, this myth explains something that at first seems like pure superstition, but is actually a deeply consistent belief that ran across multiple ancient cultures. In Rome, when a woman went into labor, everyone in the room, every attendant, every gossip, the midwife herself, was required to unbind their hair and loosen their clothing. No knots, no crossed legs, no interlocked fingers. The temple of Juno Lucina on the Esquiline Hill in Rome had a strict rule. No one could enter with a knot in their clothing. The idea was that the body's progress through birth mirrored the state of the world around it, that bonds and closures in the physical space could manifest as bonds and closures in the laboring bee. Adi. From a modern medical standpoint, there is zero physiological basis for this. But from a psychological standpoint, from the standpoint of what we now understand about how anxiety and physical tension interact with the progress of labor, there is something interesting happening here. A room full of people who are deliberately relaxed, who have loosened everything they are wearing, who have consciously uncrossed their limbs and opened their posture. That is functionally a room full of people doing something that modern researchers call co-regulation, where the calm physiological state of the people around a laboring woman actively influences her own nervous system. The Romans did not have that term, but they may have intuited the mechanism. And then, of course, there is the Christian world. If you have ever spent time with medieval European history, you will know that faith was not a compartment people moved into on Sundays. It was the air. It was the lens through which every event, every birth, every death, every illness, every recovery was understood. So when a woman faced the possibility of not surviving the birth of her child, she did not separate that possibility from her faith. She moved toward it. The most commonly invoked saint in the European medieval birthing room was Margaret of Antioch, and her story is one of those that the more you sit with it, the more you understand why it resonated so deeply with women in exactly this moment. Margaret, according to tradition, had been swallowed whole by a dragon. But she was carrying a cross, and the cross irritated the dragon's stomach so severely that the creature was compelled to let her out, whole and unharmed, from its side. In a birth girdle, in a whispered prayer, in the image traced on a talisman held close to the body during the worst of the contractions, she became the patron saint of women in labor. And the symbolism is devastatingly precise. A woman fighting her way out of something that should have consumed her, emerging whole, carrying the thing that had protected her all along. I do not know how to read that story without feeling the weight of what women were asking for when they invoked it. They were not asking for magic. They were asking for a framework, a story in which it was possible to go into the dragon's mouth and come out again. Now, here is where the history gets genuinely complicated. And I think it is worth spending some time here because the data, when you look at it carefully, tells a story that most of us do not know. We tend to carry a general assumption about how dangerous childbirth was across history. The assumption, if you were to articulate it, goes something like this. Childbirth in the past was relentlessly, uniformly deadly. It got progressively better as medicine advanced. And the worst era was probably the most distant past, the ancient world, the Middle Ages. Almost every part of that picture, it turns out, is incorrect. Research from the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure, drawing on detailed parish records across England from 1550 to 1800, found that maternal mortality per birth averaged roughly 10 per 1,000 births during the pre-industrial period, 1% per birth. That is 50 times higher than today, which is a genuinely sobering number. But it also means that 99% of births did not kill the mother. And this is the part that tends to surprise people. The risk was not evenly distributed across history. Maternal mortality peaked not in the medieval period, not in ancient Rome, no, in the most distant past. It peaked in the mid-17th century, around 1650, and then across the following century and a half, it actually improved before plateauing, and then not really falling dramatically again until the 1940s, when sulfonamide antibiotics arrived. So the story is not a simple line from terrible to better. It is a curve with a specific, identifiable spike right in the early modern period. And understanding why that spike happened tells us something important and more than a little uncomfortable. For most of human history, women gave birth at home in their own spaces, surrounded by the women of their community, tended by midwives who brought no instruments and no external bacteria into that room other than what was already present in the household. This is not me romanticizing home birth. This is me describing an epidemiological reality that researchers have had to reckon with honestly. Because here is what happened in the 17th century across Europe. A new institution began to emerge, lying in hospitals, places specifically built for women to give birth in. Initially, they served primarily poor women, women who had no home to give birth in, or whose home. Mess were so overcrowded and unsanitary that a dedicated facility seemed like an improvement. The hospitals were sometimes attached to medical teaching institutions, and in those hospitals, the same physicians and medical students who spent their mornings performing autopsies on patients who had died of infection would walk across the courtyard and go to assist women in labor in the afternoon, with the same hands unwashed. In Paris, the first clear evidence of epidemic childbed fever at the Hôtel Dieu Maternity Hospital appears in the 1660s. The year 1664 was described as particularly devastating. One account from the same institution states that in some winters, 7 out of every 12 patients contracted the fever. 7 out of 12. In some maternity wards in the early 19th century, mortality rates from childbed fever climbed as high as 26% during epidemic periods. 1 in 4 women who entered certain hospitals to give birth did not leave alive, and the terrible, almost unbearable irony of it is this. Women who could not afford a hospital and gave birth at home, women who had less access to what was considered the best available medical care, often had ETA survival rates because the hospital was where the bacteria traveled. The home, with all its inconveniences and imprecision and folk wisdom, was not introducing foreign pathogens from the dissection room. The question of whether progress in that specific moment of history was actually making things worse. That is not a comfortable question to sit with, but it is an honest one. And then there is Mary Wollstonecraft. If you know her name, you know it primarily as the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, one of the most important documents in the history of ideas about women's equality and human rights. In 1797, Mary Wollstonecraft gave birth to a daughter. The daughter survived and would go on to write Frankenstein. Her name was Mary Shelley. Mary Wollstonecraft herself did not survive. She died 11 days after the birth, and the particular cruelty of how she died is part of what makes this story so difficult to look at directly. Her labor had been attended by a midwife, so far so standard, but the placenta had not fully delivered. A doctor was called in to assist. He arrived promptly. He had almost certainly been conducting medical procedures earlier that day. He did not wash his hands. Within days, Wollstonecraft developed the characteristic signs of puerperal fever, the infection that had been sweeping through hospitals and increasingly home births attended by trained physicians. 11 days after the birth that should have been the beginning of a new chapter, she was gone. She was 38 years old. The woman who had spent her life arguing that women's minds and women's lives deserve the same respect as men's died of and infection that within 50 years would be proven to have been carried by the hands of the very doctor who was supposed to save her. If you are not feeling something right now, I would be surprised. Because this is the thing that gets me every single time I come back to this history. It was not inevitable. That is what makes it so hard. Alexander Gordon of Aberdeen, writing in 1795, had already noticed that he could trace which patient would develop childbed fever by knowing which birth attendant had delivered her. He published this observation. It was largely ignored. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the American physician and poet, made the same argument in 1843. He was largely ignored. Ignaz Semmelweis I. In 1847 proved it in the most controlled and careful way available to him at the time, and reduced deaths in his ward dramatically through the simple act of making everyone wash their hands in chlorinated lime solution before entering. And he too was ignored by colleagues, by the institution, by the men whose reputations would have been implicated in the admission that their unwashed hands had been killing women for decades. We will spend more time with Semmelweis when we get there. His story deserves its own chapter, but for right now, I want to sit with this for just a moment. The women who prayed to Juno Lucina and Margaret of Antioch understood at some level that birth was a threshold, a place where something could be lost. Their religious architecture was built around that understanding. What they could not have known was that, in the era that believed itself most advanced, most scientific, most modern, the hospitals that were supposed to make things better were for a time making them measurably worse. And the ordinary women who gave birth at home with their midwives and their gossips and their warm oil and their prayers, they were statistically safer. There is a lesson in that somewhere. I am not entirely sure it is a comfortable one. But discomfort, when it comes from honest history, is not something to avoid. It is something to learn from. And what we are about to learn in the next part of this story is where the danger actually lived. Not in the drama of the birth itself, but in the days that followed. Because the death that most people imagine as happening in the birthing room very often did not happen there at all. It crept in quietly after the midwife had gone home and the candles had been blown out in the first hours, the first days, a fever that came gently and then did not. And how women understood that, prayed against it, tried to survive it, and how one man eventually figured out what was causing it, only to be destroyed for saying so. That is where we are headed now. The numbers, when you look at them carefully and honestly, tell a story that is more complicated and in some ways more hopeful than you might expect. And in one very specific century, everything got dramatically, unexpectedly worse before it got better. That century is not the one you would guess. Here is what I find so striking about the modern picture. We tend to carry a genus assumption about how dangerous childbirth was across history. The assumption, if you were to articulate it, goes something like this. Childbirth in the past was relentlessly, uniformly deadly. It got progressively better as medicine advanced. And the worst era was probably the most distant past, the ancient world, the Middle Ages. Almost every part of that picture, it turns out, is incorrect. Research from the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure, drawing on detailed parish records across England from 1550 to 1800, found that maternal mortality per birth averaged roughly 10 per 1,000 births during the pre-industrial period. 1% per birth. That is 50 times higher than today, which is a genuinely sobering number. But it also means that 99% of births did not kill the mother. And this is the part that tends to surprise people. The risk was not evenly distributed across history. Maternal mortality peaked not in the medieval period, not in ancient Rome, not in the most distant past. It peaked in the mid-17th century, around 1650. And then, across the following century and a half, it actually improved before plateauing and then not really falling dramatically again until the 1940s, when sulfonamide antibiotics arrived. So the story is not a simple line from terrible to better. It is a curve with a specific, identifiable spike right in the early modern period. And understanding why that spike happened tells us something important and more than a little uncomfortable. For most of human history, women gave birth at home in their own spaces, surrounded by the women of their community, tended by midwives who brought no instruments and no external bacteria into that room other than what was already present in the household. This is not me romanticizing home birth. This is me describing an epidemiological reality that researchers have had to reckon with honestly. Because here is what happened. In the 17th century across Europe, a new institution began to emerge, lying in hospitals, places specifically built for women to give birth in. Initially, they served primarily poor women, women who had no home to give birth in or whose homes were so overcrowded and unsanitary that a dedicated facility seemed like an improvement. The hospitals were sometimes attached to medical teaching institutions. And in those hospitals, the same physicians and medical students who spent their mornings performing autopsies on patients who had died of infection would walk across the courtyard and go to assist women in labor in the afternoon, with the same hands unwashed. In Paris, the first clear evidence of epidemic childbed fever at the Hôtel du Maternity Hospital appears in the 1660s. The year 1664 was described as particularly devastating. One account from the same institution states that in some winters, 7 out of every 12 patients contracted the fever. 7 out of 12. In some maternity wards in the early 19th century, mortality rates from childbed fever climbed as high as 26% during epidemic periods. 1 in 4 women who entered certain hospitals to give birth did not leave alive. And the terrible, almost unbearable irony of it is this. Women who could not afford a hospital and gave birth at home, women who had less access to what was considered the best available medical care, often had better survival rates. Because the hospital was where the bacteria traveled. The home, with all its inconveniences and imprecision and folk wisdom, was not introducing GN pathogens from the dissection room. The question of whether progress in that specific moment of history was actually making things worse. That is not a comfortable question to sit with, but it is an honest one. And then there is Mary Wollstonecraft. If you know her name, you know it primarily as the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, one of the most important documents in the history of ideas about women's equality and human rights. In 1797, Mary Wollstonecraft gave birth to a daughter. The daughter survived and would go on to write Frankenstein. Her name was Mary Shelley. Mary Wollstonecraft herself did not survive. She died 11 days after the birth, and the particular cruelty of how she died is part of what makes this story so difficult to look at directly. Her labor had been attended by a midwife, so far so standard, but the placenta had not fully delivered. A doctor was called in to assist. He arrived promptly. He had almost certainly been conducting medical procedures earlier that day. He did not wash his hands. Within days, Wollstonecraft developed the characteristic signs of puerperal fever, the infection that had been sweeping through hospitals and increasingly home births attended by trained physicians. 11 days after the birth, that should have been the beginning of a new chapter, she was gone. She was 38 years old. The woman who had spent her life arguing that women's minds and women's lives deserve the same respect as men's died of infection, that within 50 years would be proven to have been carried by the hands of the very doctor who was supposed to save her. If you are not feeling something right now, I would be surprised, because this is the thing that gets me every single time I come back to this history. It was not inevitable. That is what makes it so hard. Alexander Gordon of Aberdeen, writing in 1795, had already noticed that he could trace which patient would develop childbed fever by knowing which birth attendant had delivered her. He published this observation. He was largely ignored. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the American physician and poet, made the same argument in 1843. He was largely ignored. Ignaz Semmelweis in 1847 proved it in the most controlled and careful way available to him at Caen, and reduced deaths in his ward dramatically through the simple act of making everyone wash their hands in chlorinated lime solution before entering. And he too was ignored. We will spend more time with Semmelweis when we get there. His story deserves its own chapter, but for right now, I want to sit with this for just a moment. The women who prayed to Juno, Lucina, and Margaret of Antioch understood at some level that birth was a threshold, a place where something could be lost. Their religious architecture was built around that understanding. What they could not have known was that in the era that believed itself most advanced, most scientific, most modern, the hospitals that were supposed to make things better were for a time making them measurably worse. And the ordinary women who gave birth at home with their midwives and their gossips and their warm oil and their prayers, they were statistically safer. There is a lesson in that somewhere. I am not entirely sure it is a comfortable one, but discomfort, when it comes from honest history, is not something to avoid. It is something to learn from. And what we are about to learn in the next part of this story is where the danger actually lived. Not in the drama of the birth itself, but in the days that followed. Because the death that most people imagine as happening in the birthing room very often did not happen there at all. It crept in quietly after the midwife had gone home and the candles had been blown out in the first hours, the first days. A fever that came gently and then did not. And how women understood that, prayed against it, tried to survive it, and how one man eventually figured out what was causing it, only to be destroyed for saying so. That is where we are headed now. There are stories in history that stay with you long after you finish reading them, not because they are triumphant, not because they end well, but because they are so precisely, so piercingly unfair, that something in you refuses to let them go. This is one of those stories. The man at the center of it is named Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis, and if you've never heard of him, that is partly the point. The year is 1846, Vienna, Austria. The city is one of the intellectual capitals of Europe. Its medical school is considered among the finest in the world. The General Hospital, the Allgemeine Krankenhaus, is the largest teaching hospital on the continent. And inside this great hospital, in the maternity ward known as the First Obstetrical Clinic, women are dying at a rate that no one can explain. Not a handful, not occasionally. In some months, as many as 1 in 8 women who enter that ward to give birth do not leave alive. They arrive in labor. They deliver their babies. And then within 2 or 3 days, the fever comes. It starts quietly, a slight warmth, a tenderness in the abdomen. By the 2nd day, it is climbing. By the 3rd day, in the worst cases, it is consuming everything. The doctors call it childbed fever, puerperal fever, and they have accepted it in the way that people accept things that have always been present, as simply a fact of institutional life. Here is the thing that makes this story so strange from the very beginning. Directly across the corridor, separated by a single wall, operating under the same hospital administration, serving the same city, is the 2nd obstetrical clinic. In the 2nd clinic, women also give birth. They come from the same social backgrounds. They live in the same neighborhoods. They eat the same food. They breathe the same air. The mortality rate in the 2nd clinic is roughly 2%. The mortality rate in the 1st clinic is nearly 10,000 times higher. Women in Vienna knew this. They knew it the way communities know things that official records sometimes miss. And so women in labor, already frightened, already in pain, would arrive at the hospital gates and beg the admitting staff to be placed in the 2nd clinic. Some of them, according to records of the time, would choose to give birth on the street outside the hospital rather than risk being assigned to the 1st clinic, on the street, in the cold, alone. Because the ward run by midwives felt safer than the ward run by doctors. And they were right. Into this situation, in 1846, walks a young Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis. He is 28 years old. He is intensely curious. He is, by several accounts of people who worked with him, also not particularly easy to get along with. Stubborn, blunt, unwilling to pretend uncertainty when he felt certain. These qualities would both save lives and ultimately destroy him. Semmelweis is assigned to the first clinic, and from his first weeks there, the mortality numbers gnaw at him. He begins to ask the question that in retrospect seems almost offensively obvious. Why? He eliminates one possibility after another. Our birth position. The women in the first clinic are delivered lying on their backs. The women in the second clinic deliver on their sides. He asks the doctors in the first clinic to adopt the side position. The mortality rates stay exactly the same. A bell. A priest walks through the first clinic after each death, ringing a small bell as he delivers last rites. Semmelweis proposes that the sound might be psychologically devastating to the women, triggering terror that somehow accelerates their decline. He asks the priest to take a different route. The mortality rates stay exactly the same. Ventilation, air quality, overcrowding. He checks each one. The numbers do not move. He writes at this point in his memoirs something that I find genuinely devastating in its honesty. The puerperal disease remains a mystery. Only the number of the dead is a palpable fact. He is so overwhelmed that in March of 1847 he takes leave and travels to Venice for a brief rest. When he returns, there is a message waiting for him. His colleague and close friend, Jakub Kolečka, a professor of forensic medicine who spent his working days supervising autopsies, had died while Semmelweis was away. Dur. An autopsy. A student had accidentally nicked Kolečka's finger with a scalpel. Within days, Kolečka had developed a fever. His abdomen became inflamed, his lungs filled. He died with symptoms that Semmelweis, reading the autopsy report on the night he returned, recognized with a shock that he would later describe as total illumination. The symptoms were identical to those of the women dying of childbed fever. Not similar, identical. And Kolečka had not given birth. Kolečka had been cut with a contaminated scalpel, and it hit Semmelweis. The entire picture, all at once, like a door being blown open. The doctors and medical students in the first clinic began their mornings in the autopsy rooms. They dissected cadavers. They examined tissue from bodies in various stages of decomposition. And then they walked across the courtyard and into the maternity ward and began examining women in labor, with the same hands, unwashed. He called what they were carrying cadaverous particles, tiny invisible remnants of decaying organic matter transferred from the dead to the living. He did not yet have the language of bacteria or germ theory. That would come later from Pasteur A. Ninth list. But he had something perhaps more important. He had the mechanism. He had the answer. On the 15th of May, 1847, Semmelweis implemented his solution. Every person entering the maternity ward, doctors, students, anyone who had been in contact with cadavers, was required to wash their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime before examining any patient. It was not a suggestion. It was a mandate. The solution smelled harsh. It was hard on the skin. The students complained. Semmelweis stationed himself near the washing basin and did not flinch. The results were almost immediate. In April of 1847, before the policy, the mortality rate in the first clinic was 18%. In the months after the policy was implemented, it fell. Then it fell further. By the end of 1848, in March, and then again in August, not a single woman died of childbed fever in Semmelweis's ward. Not one. He had data, beautiful, unambiguous, undeniable data, tables of numbers that showed month by month the before and after. One researcher who looked at these tables more than a century later described them as the best data ever, absolutely clean, visually compelling, impossible to misread. Semmelweis had functionally cured the disease. And here is where the story becomes almost unbearable. No one believed him, or rather, some people believed him, and many powerful people did not, and the ones who did not held the positions that determined what happened next. The dominant medical theory of the time held that disease arose from internal imbalances, disruptions in the four humors of the body, or from miasma, the mysterious bad air that was thought to drift through institutions and cause illness. Semmelweis's theory required something different. It required doctors to accept that they were the cause. That their hands, the hands they used to heal, the trained hands of educated professional men, were carrying death from the morgue to the maternity ward. That all those women who had died in the first clinic had, in some terrible sense, been killed by the very people assigned to protect them. That is not a comfortable truth to absorb, and for many physicians of that era, it was simply not absorbed. His superior, Professor Johann Klein, opposed him openly, consistently, with the particular fervor of a man whose institution was being implicated in mass-preventable death. Colleagues argued that Semmelweis's theory was too simple, that disease could not have a single cause, when each patient was unique. Others said he was claiming credit for ideas that were not truly new. Some were quietly offended by the suggestion that they should wash their hands at all, as though the implication itself was beneath their dignity. In 1849, Semmelweis's position at the Vienna clinic was not renewed. He was effectively pushed out. He returned to Budapest. He implemented his hand-washing protocol at the hospital there. The mortality rates fell again, just as they had in Vienna. He watched this happen. He documented it. He sent letters to prominent obstetricians across Europe. He waited for the world to change. The world did not change. Not quickly enough, not in his lifetime. In 1861, after 14 years of being urged to write up his findings formally, Semmelweis finally published his definitive work, a dense, detailed, sometimes angry book laying out everything he had observed and proven. He sent copies to leading obstetricians throughout Europe. The reception was largely indifferent. One prominent critic, a professor named Carl Edvard Marius Levi, a man of considerable reputation, ion and influence, wrote that he preferred to believe that childbed fever arose naturally within the patient's own body, because he could not accept that his own hands had ever harmed a patient. I prefer, he wrote, essentially, not to believe this. And so women continued to die. In 1854, in Vienna, the city where Semmelweis had made his discovery, 400 maternity patients died of childbed fever. He wrote about it with a grief that I find difficult to read even now. It weighs on my conscience, he wrote, that thousands upon thousands of mothers and infants have perished, lives that could have been saved. By the early 1860s, Semmelweis's mental health was deteriorating. Historians still debate the precise cause. Some point to severe depression and the cumulative weight of years of rejection. Some suggest physical illness. Some note that he had been exposed through his medical work to conditions that could cause neurological damage. Whatever the specific cause, the man who had saved more mothers than perhaps any physician in history was unraveling. His behavior became erratic, his speech at times disconnected. His wife and colleagues, watching with alarm and grief, decide that he needed institutional care. In the summer of 1865, they brought him to Vienna. He believed he was going to a spa, somewhere restful. Instead, a former colleague named Ferdinand Hebre, the same man who had enthusiastically promoted Semmelweis's findings years earlier, delivered him to a mental asylum in the Lazarette gas. When Semmelweis realized what was happening, he tried to leave. The guards of the asylum restrained him. He was beaten. He was placed in a straitjacket. He was put in a cold cell. 2 weeks later, on the 13th of August, 1865, Ignaz Semmelweis was dead. He was 47 years old. His autopsy revealed the cause of death: sepsis, blood poisoning, originating from a wound on his right hand, a wound almost certainly inflicted during the struggle with the guards. He died of the infection he had spent his entire professional life trying to prevent. He died of it alone in an asylum, 2 weeks after being committed by the people who were supposed to love and understand him. And he died before Louis Pasteur confirmed the germ theory of disease, before Joseph Lister operationalized antiseptic surgical practice, before the world finally had the theoretical framework. Work to explain exactly why Semmelweis had been right all along. There is a term in psychology, the Semmelweis reflex. It refers to the human tendency to reject new information that contradicts established beliefs, regardless of how strong the evidence is. Named after him, named after the man who proved with the cleanest data his era could produce that washing hands saves lives, and was committed to a mental institution for saying so.
I do not think that term is mocking him.
I think it is a kind of memorial, a way of saying, we know this happens. We have a name for it now because of what happened to you. We are trying to be more careful. And here is what I want to ask you, sitting with this story tonight. How many Semmelweises are there in any field, in any era? People who see something real, something important, and true, and verifiable, and who are too far ahead of the frameworks available to them for anyone in power to accept what they are saying. People who are right and who pay for being right. History has a frustrating habit of naming things after the people who discovered them, long after those people are gone, long after the vindication could do them any good. Semmelweis is called the savior of mothers now. He died alone in a padded cell, beaten with blood poisoning on his hand. The gap between those two things, between the honor we give him now and the treatment he received then, is not a small gap. It is the size of a human life. I want to be careful here, though, because the story of Semmelweis is sometimes told in a way that is too simple, too much the lone genius against the corrupt institution, because the truth is more complicated than that, and more honest. The doctors who rejected him were not all villains. Some of them were working within a genuinely different theoretical framework, one that, given the tools available at the time, had its own internal logic. Some of them were protecting their reputations in the only ways available to them. Some of them were, in private, quietly implementing hand-washing without publicly crediting him. A fact that is either hypocritical or pragmatic, depending on how generously you choose to read it. And Semmelweis himself, difficult, blunt, sometimes maddening in his refusal to compromise or publish, was not without flaws that contributed to how his ideas were received. That does not make what happened to H. I'm acceptable, but it makes it human. And humanness, the full, complicated, sometimes terrible humanness of people trying to navigate questions that are bigger than the tools they have, is what this entire story has been about. Now, we've spent time in the dark places of this history, in the wards where women died, in the institutions where the people who could have saved them were silenced. But the shadow we have been sitting with, the shadow of childbed fever and institutional failure, and the long delay between knowing and acting, that shadow has a particular shape. It falls unevenly. Not all women faced the same risks. Not all bodies were considered equally worthy of care. The question of who got to give birth safely, who was surrounded by comfort and skill, and who was left to manage alone, was never just a medical question. It was always also a question of wealth, of class, of privilege. And the answers to that question, when you look at them closely, are far more surprising and far more troubling than you might expect. Because the women who had the most access to the best available care were not always the ones who survived, and the women who had the least were not always the ones who died. That paradox is where we are going next. Let me ask you something before we go any further. If I told you that, in a certain historical period, the women who were poorest, who had the least food security, the most physical labor, the fewest material comforts, sometimes had better survival rates in childbirth than the women who had every privilege available, what would you make of that? Because the data, when you look at it honestly, tells exactly that story, and the reasons why are both fascinating and deeply unsettling. We tend to carry an intuition about wealth and health that feels self-evidently true. More money means better food. Better food means a stronger body. A stronger body means a better chance of surviving a difficult pregnancy. It is logical. It is reasonable. And when it comes to childbirth across most of human history, it is frequently wrong. The paradox of class and childbirth in the pre-modern and early modern world is one of the more disorienting findings in the entire history of medicine. And it reveals something important not just about the past, but about the relationship between privilege and safety that is far more complicated than we usually SSU may. Let's start with the peerage, the British aristocracy, the women who sat at the very top of the social hierarchy. These women had access to the best physicians of their era. They had warm, comfortable homes with adequate fuel and clean water. They ate well, or at least abundantly. When they were ill, someone came. When they were in labor, the most credentialed practitioners available were summoned. And yet, research examining the reproductive histories of aristocratic British women from the mid-16th through the 19th century found that these women had measurably higher maternal mortality rates than their less privileged counterparts. The title of one historical study says it plainly. It is a misfortune to be a great lady. How is that possible? The answer, when you piece it together from the various threads of the historical record, turns out to involve at least 3 distinct mechanisms, each one a different way in which privilege itself became a liability. The first mechanism is one that almost nobody talks about, and it is, once you understand it, almost elegantly simple. Breastfeeding. Working-class women in pre-modern England and Europe almost universally breastfed their own children, not because of any ideology or philosophy about it. Quite practically, they had no other option. And breastfeeding, while a child is nursing, actively suppresses ovulation. The technical term is lactational amenorrhea, the natural suppression of fertility during the period of intensive nursing. For a working woman who breastfed her infant, this meant that her body had time to recover between pregnancies, a year, sometimes longer. Her nutritional stores could replenish. Her uterine tissue could rest. The cumulative physical toll of repeated pregnancies was to some degree naturally limited. Aristocratic and upper-class women did not breastfeed, not because they could not, but because they chose not to, or because the social expectations of their class made it effectively impossible. It was considered in many circles incompatible with a lady's social obligations, with the demands on her time, with a certain idea of refinement that positioned nursing as something done by women of lower station. The solution was the wet nurse, another woman, usually recently delivered herself, who was hired to nurse the aristocratic infant. This solved the immediate practical problem. But it also meant that the aristocratic mother's fertility returned almost immediately after each birth. And so, aristocratic women, through much of this period, were pregnant again within months. 20 pregnancies was not considered exceptional among women of the highest social classes in the 16th through 18th centuries. 20 pregnancies, each one carrying its own individual risk, each one demanding something from a body that had barely had time to recover from the last. The very custom that was meant to signal refinement and status, the employment of a wet nurse, was silently multiplying the biological hazard that each aristocratic woman faced across her lifetime. The second mechanism is fashion, and specifically the corset. Now, I want to be careful here, because the history of corsets and health is genuinely more complicated than popular legend suggests. The idea that corsets removed ribs and permanently collapsed the internal organs of every woman who wore one is largely exaggerated. But something real was happening in the bodies of women who wore tight-laced garments from childhood, and it had specific consequences for childbirth. Girls from aristocratic and upper-class families began wearing stays, the forerunner of the corset, a stiffened bodice that shaped the torso from early childhood, sometimes from infancy. The bones of a growing child are malleable in a way that adult bones are not. When consistent, sustained pressure is applied to a developing rib cage and pelvis over years of childhood growth, the shape of those bones can change. The pelvis, in particular, sits at the center of the entire calculus of childbirth. The passage through which a baby must travel is determined by the internal dimensions of the pelvic bones. A pelvis shaped by years of tight lacing during childhood growth could be subtly narrowed. The difference between a pelvis that allows a baby to pass through with difficulty and one that does not allow it at all could be measured in millimeters. 18th century physicians who treated wealthy urban women began documenting this pattern. William Smellie, the same man who trained nearly 900 man midwives in 10 years, wrote extensively about what he called contracted pelvis in his patients. He developed systematic methods for measuring pelvic dimensions and taught his students to identify deformities. Among the cases he documented, the pattern appeared with notable frequency in women of higher social standing. Women who had been corseted since childhood, women who had grown up with their bodies shaped by the demands of fashion. And the link was not invisible to contemporary observers. A physician named Thomas Denman wrote in 1787 quite directly, "The lower orders of women have more easy and favorable births than those who live in affluence." He did not fully understand why, but he'd noticed the pattern with his own eyes across a career of attending births in both wealthy homes and among ordinary working women. And then there is the third factor, the one that I suspect surprises people most. By the 18th century, and increasingly through the 19th, the custom among wealthy urban women was to employ a male physician, an accoucheur, a man midwife, later simply an obstetrician, to attend their births. This was a marker of status. It was expensive. It was fashionable. It signaled a family's position. And we've already established through the story of Semmelweis that the men most likely to transmit childbed fever were the ones who came to the birthing room directly from other medical work, from examining sick patients, from post-mortem dissections, from the general circulation of a busy medical practice. The rural poor woman who gave birth, attended by a local midwife, who spent her days exclusively in midwifery, and who had no contact with cadavers, was statistically less exposed to the specific pathogen that caused childbed fever. The wealthy urban woman attended by the most credentialed physician in the city was more exposed. Status bought her access to the most dangerous vector of the disease. It is an inversion so complete and so ironic that it feels almost contrived. But the numbers bore it out consistently enough that researchers noticed and documented it across multiple countries and multiple centuries. There are names attached to this paradox, and I want to give you at least one of them, because the abstract becomes real only when you can attach it to a specific person in a specific room. The name is Jane Seymour. The year is 1537. She is the third wife of King Henry VIII of England. She has given him what all the courts of Europe understood to be the only thing that truly mattered, a male heir. The future King Edward VI was born on the 12th of October 1537, after a labor that lasted 2 full days and 3 nights. For a few days after the birth, Jane seemed to be recovering. She sat up in bed. She received guests. She hosted the christening gathering for her newborn son. And then the fever came. 12 days after the birth, on the 24th of October 1537, Jane Seymour died at Hampton Court Palace. She was approximately 29 years old. She had been Queen of England for less than a year and a half. Henry VIII had waited for a legitimate male heir through the entirety of his turbulent marital history, through Catherine of Aragon, through Anne Boleyn, through the destruction of 2 marriages and the reshaping of an entire church. He wore black for months after her death. He was eventually buried beside her. She was the only one of his 6 wives to receive a state funeral. And none of it, none of the power, the wealth, the best physicians the Tudor court could offer, had been able to protect her from something but a basic understand. Infection would have made preventable. Jane Seymour died in one of the most magnificently appointed palaces in England. She died attended by some of the most educated men in the kingdom. She died of something we can now treat with a course of antibiotics. I find myself sitting with a question that I cannot entirely resolve when I look at stories like hers. We talk a lot about privilege as a form of protection, and across most of the dimensions of life it is. But here, in this very specific arena of human experience, in the birthing room across several centuries, privilege was operating in ways that complicated and sometimes actively undermined the safety of the women who had the most of it. Too many pregnancies, too little recovery time, bones shaped by fashion, physicians who carried invisible danger into the room. And at the other end of the social spectrum, women who had almost nothing, whose lives were physically harder, whose diets were less abundant, whose homes were less warm, sometimes moved through childbirth with a resilience that surprised the physicians who observed them. Not because suffering is ennobling, it is not, and I want to say that plainly, but because the body's relationship with childbirth is not simply a function of resources. It is shaped by time, by spacing, by the accumulated physical history of a life. A woman who breastfed her children for 2 years between each pregnancy was giving her body something that money could not buy, and fashion actively discouraged. A woman whose pelvis had never been compressed by childhood corseting had a different set of physical odds than one who had been laced since the age of 4. Now, there is a class story here that moves in the other direction too. Because while wealthy women were navigating one set of risks, poor women faced entirely different dangers that were no less real, and in many ways far less documented. A poor woman who could not afford a midwife at all, who labored alone or attended only by a neighbor with no training, faced risks that the historical record struggles to count because nobody was keeping track of her. The paradox of class and childbirth in history is not simply that poor women had it better. It is that the relationship between money and safety was genuinely unpredictable, genuinely unstable, and that the specific ways in which different women were vulnerable onto the specific conditions of their lives in ways that no simple formula could capture. Here is what stays with me about all of this. We are often tempted to tell the history of medicine and childbirth as a story of progress. Things get worse, and then they get better. Ignorance is followed by knowledge. Danger is followed by safety. And in the broadest strokes, that is true. But the details resist the clean line. Because in the middle of that long arc, there were specific moments where the women with the most resources faced dangers created by those very resources. Specific moments where the women with the least found something like protection in the simplicity of their circumstances. Specific moments where progress, the lying-in hospital, the fashionable physician, the expensive man midwife, made things worse for particular groups of women before it made things better. That is not a comfortable story, but it is an honest one, and honesty, I think, is the only thing that history actually owes us. So where does this bring us? We have moved over the course of this journey from the sacred, candlelit room where men were not permitted to enter, all the way through the folk remi. Dies and the prayers and the midwives and the dragon and Semmelweis and the paradoxes of class and privilege. We have been sitting with the reality of what childbirth meant, not as an abstraction but as a lived experience carried differently by women in different bodies in different circumstances across centuries. What we have not yet looked at is what happened in the days and weeks that followed, because in many ways surviving the birth itself was only the beginning of a long and complicated process. What a woman returned to, what the world expected of her, how she was treated, what rituals surrounded her re-entry into daily life. That story is one that history has largely left in silence. And silence in this context turns out to be one of the most revealing things of all. After everything we have walked through together, the births, the remedies, the fevers, the figures, whose stories cut right down to the bone, there is a world I have barely touched yet. The world that came after the door of the birthing room opened for the first time. What did a woman return to? What were the days and weeks that followed a birth in a time before maternity leave, or pediatric checkups, or the particular modern anxiety of scrolling through baby forums at 2 in the morning? The answer, as it turns out, is both more structured and more complicated than anything I expected when I first started researching it. Let's start with the lying in. In England, across most of Europe, and in many cultures around the world, there was a period after childbirth that was treated as fundamentally separate from ordinary life. The woman did not simply recover from the birth and return to her duties. She withdrew. She was kept apart, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, in a protected, enclosed domestic space where the rules of everyday existence were temporarily suspended. For women of means, this period could begin weeks before the birth and extend well beyond it. A queen or noblewoman would take her chamber, a formal ceremony of withdrawal from public life, in which she retreated to rooms prepared specifically for the purpose. Hung with tapestries, shuttered against daylight, warmed, carefully managed. Even for ordinary women, women who could not afford to stop working indefinitely, there was an expectation of some period of reduced activity, some degree of separation from the world, some acknowledgement that the body had been through something profound and required time. In 17th century England, records show that the period immediately after birth was understood to last roughly 3 to 5 weeks, during which the new mother was largely confined to bed and then to the household. A temporary nurse was often hired for households that could afford it. A woman who came not to help with the baby, but to take over the domestic duties that the new mother could not fulfill, freeing her to rest. And a specific word was used for these post-birth visitors, women who came to see the new mother, to sit with her, to bring food and drink and news. They called it taking caudle. A caudle was a warm spiced drink, something between a thin porridge and a mulled wine, that was served to new mothers as a restorative. The custom of visiting a new mother with something warm and nourishing was so deeply embedded that the phrase itself became shorthand for the whole social ritual of postpartum community care. You did not just visit a friend who'd given birth, you took caudle with her. I find that detail quietly beautiful. But here is the thing about the lying-in that I want to sit with for a moment. It has been interpreted across history in at least 2 very different ways. One interpretation, the harsher reading, sees it as a form of control, as the institutionalization of a view that a woman who had given birth was somehow contaminated, impure, in need of purification before she could re-enter society. The roots of this reading are real. The biblical text of Leviticus specified that a woman was ritually unclean for a set number of days after birth. 33 days for a son, 66 for a daughter. This distinction alone tells you something uncomfortable about the relative valuation of male and female lives from the very beginning. The second interpretation is more sympathetic and, I think, more nuanced. A woman who had just given birth, who might have bled significantly, whose body had undergone one of the most physically demanding experiences a human being can have, was being given permission to stop, to not cook, to not clean, to not tend to everyone else's needs before her own. The lying-in, from this angle, looks less like a punishment and more like an enforced rest that someone had calculated was necessary for survival. And given what we now know, about how dangerous the postpartum period was, given the vulnerability to infection, to hemorrhage, to the specific kind of exhaustion that compounds if it is not addressed, that enforced rest was not purely symbolic. It was practical. It was medicine disguised as ritual. The historian Paul Marshall has observed that, in agricultural societies, the lying-in may have served exactly this function, protecting a new mother from resuming work too soon, with the weight of religious obligation doing what no medical prescription could have enforced. Because what else in a world without doctors who understood postpartum physiology would have made a woman stop? And after the lying-in came churching. If you have spent any time in historical documents or old parish registers, you have probably seen references to it without necessarily knowing exactly what it was. Churching was the ceremony that formally ended the period of postpartum separation and returned a woman to full participation in the community. She would go to the church, in Catholic tradition, carrying a lighted candle, making an offering at the altar. Prayers were said over her. The priest blessed her, and she walked back into the world. The theology around this ceremony was genuinely contested, even in the medieval and early modern periods, and it remains contested by historians today. Was it purification? Was it thanksgiving? Was it simply a community marking the transition from one phase of life to the next? The official position of the Church, articulated by Pope Gregory I as early as the 6th century, was that childbirth carried no moral taint, that a woman was not sinful for having given birth, and therefore was not in need of cleansing from sin. He wrote explicitly that women should never be separated from the Church on the grounds that childbirth was polluting. And yet, in popular practice, the sense of a necessary restoration, of a threshold that needed to be formally crossed before a woman could fully re-enter society, persisted for centuries. In the mid-16th century, when the English Reformation overhauled the prayer book, the official title of the ceremony was changed from Corne, the purification of women, to the thanksgiving of women after childbirth, a significant shift. But women themselves, according to historical records from the 17th and 18th centuries, continued to treat it as a social occasion that they genuinely anticipated, not a purification they were required to endure, but a celebration they looked forward to. David Cressy, the historian who studied this most carefully, found that women actively insisted on being churched, that they looked forward to it as an occasion to dress well, invite friends, and be seen publicly after weeks of confinement. One 17th-century English woman, delayed in her churching, wrote that she had looked forward to it this fortnight, that the ceremony represented not a marking of her impurity, but a marking of her survival. She had gone in, she'd come back, and the community was there to witness it. Now, what I find most extraordinary about the history of postpartum care is not what Europe did. It is what the rest of the world did, and how strikingly, stubbornly similar it all was across cultures that had no contact with each other, across traditions that arose independently across centuries and oceans and belief systems that shared almost nothing else. In China, the tradition is called Zuo Yuzai. It translates roughly as sitting the month after birth. A woman retreats. She does not leave the house. She does not wash her hair or bathe in cold water. She does not do physical labor. She is fed specific foods, warming foods, according to the principles of traditional Chinese medicine, intended to restore the balance of hot and cold that childbirth has disrupted. In ancient China, the confinement period lasted 100 days. Modern Chinese medical recommendations still suggest a minimum of 42 days. In India, the tradition is called japa in the north, or variously Sutika Paracharya in Ayurvedic practice. 40 days of confinement, daily warm oil massage to soothe the nervous system and restore circulation. Food prepared according to specific principles, soft, warming, easy to digest, high in iron and protein. Visitors managed carefully. Physical rest treated as non-negotiable. In Nigeria, the practice of amagwo calls for 30 days of care, with the new mother cared for by her own mother or mother-in-law. She is given pepper soup. She receives warm body massages. She is not expected to cook, clean, or manage the household. In Latin America, across Mexico and Central America and South America, the practice is called la cuarentena, the quarantine, the 40 days during which the mother rests and is fed and tended by the women around her. In Korea, the period is called sanhyujori, 21 days at minimum, ideally longer. Seaweed soup at every meal, because the iron and iodine in it are understood to replenish what was lost in birth. In Japan, the mother returns to her own birth family, to her own mother's home for the first month, where she is cared for rather than expected to care for anyone else. Do you notice something remarkable here? Across all of these traditions that developed independently on different continents, within entirely different medical and theological frameworks, there is a common understanding. The woman who has just given birth is not immediately available. She is not fully back yet. She requires time, warmth, nourishment, and the active care of the community around her. And the specific number keeps recurring. 30 days, 40 days, 1 month, the green month. Not because these cultures were copying each other, but because somewhere, accumulated over thousands of years of observation, the wisdom of multiple independent human communities converged on the same conclusion: that the weeks after birth are as critical as the birth itself. That recovery is not an inconvenience to be minimized, but a necessity to be respected. That a woman who has just done the most physically demanding thing a human body can do deserves to be genuinely, substantively cared for. Modern research confirms what ancient practice intuited. The 6 weeks following birth, the period now called the 4th trimester in contemporary perinatal medicine, are a time of significant hormonal upheaval, immune vulnerability, and physical repair. Studies consistently show that postpartum depression, birth complications, and maternal mortality are all influenced by the quality of rest and support a woman receives in this period. The women who had community around them, whose cultures built care into the social structure rather than leaving it to individual families to figure out, were not being indulged. They were being protected. And here is where I want to offer you a question that I find myself returning to. At some point in the industrialization of Western society, through the 19th century and into the 20th, these traditions faded. The lying-in period shortened. The monthly nurse became a luxury few could afford. Churching declined and eventually disappeared from most Protestant practice. The cultural architecture of postpartum care, the customs that had been embedded in everyday life, in religious ritual, in the expectations of neighbors and extended family, dismantled itself. Women went back to work sooner. Visitors were managed differently. The isolation of the nuclear family replaced the circle of women. And now, in many Western countries, new mothers are expected to be functional, to be seen in public, to resume some approximation of normal life within days of giving birth. In the United States, which has no federally mandated paid maternity leave, the pressure on some women to return to work within weeks of giving birth is not hypothetical. It is routine. I am not romanticizing the past. The lying-in period was not only warmth and caudal and community. It was also, as we've discussed, a theological framework that treated women's bodies as requiring purification. It was also, in some contexts, the enforced isolation of women from public life. These things existed alongside each other. History is always that complicated, but I do think there is something worth sitting with in the fact that at multiple independent cultures across thousands of years, and every inhabited continent built recovery time into the social structure after birth, and that we, in the most technologically advanced era in human history, have largely dismantled that. What have we lost? What have we gained? Those are not easy questions, but they are honest ones. And there is one more corner of this story that I want to show you before we move on. Because not every woman who survived the birth and the postpartum period emerged unchanged. Some survived and found that survival had cost them something they had not expected, something that the historical record barely acknowledges, that medicine barely acknowledged until very recently, but that the women themselves knew was real. The man who first recognized it was not celebrated for doing so. He was mostly dismissed. And the women he was trying to help had been dismissed far longer. The story of what we now call postpartum mental health. The history of how women's emotional experience after birth was understood, misunderstood, ignored, pathologized, and finally gradually taken seriously is where we are headed next. It is a quieter story than Semmelweis, but it is in some ways even harder to hear. Quietly between the birth and the recovery, between the candles and the churching, between the warm oil and the prayers, something else was happening to some women. Something that did not have a name for most of human history. Something that, when it finally got a name in the 19th century, was named in a way that told you exactly how the world thought about it. They called it puerperal insanity. And the story of how that name came to be and what it meant and what it cost, and what it finally took to replace it with something more honest, is one of the most quietly devastating chapters in the entire history of women's health. Let's start with what was actually happening after a birth. Sometimes days later, sometimes weeks. Some women found themselves in a state that went far beyond the ordinary exhaustion and adjustment of new motherhood. The darkness would come in waves, or it would come all at once. Some women felt a grief that had no source they could identify, a hollowness, a conviction that they were failing at something that everyone around them seemed to be managing effortlessly. Some women experienced something more acute. A fractured quality to their thoughts. A fear that gripped them without logic, a sense that the world had become threatening in ways they could not explain. And some women, in the most severe cases, experienced what we would now call psychosis, hallucinations, delusions, a complete fracturing of the boundary between what was real and what was not. These experiences were not new in the 19th century. They had always existed. What was new was that doctors began paying systematic attention to them. And the first time they did so in any organized way, the first person who sat down and attempted to document and understand what was happening to women after birth was a French psychiatrist named Louis Victor Marseille. Marseille was born in Paris in 1828. He was, by all accounts, a phenomenally productive and rigorous mind. In the space of 8 years of active medical writing, he produced work on an extraordinary range of psychiatric subjects. But the work that would define his legacy, the work that would eventually have an entire international society of perinatal psychiatry named after him, was published in 1858. It was a nearly 400-page monograph, a comprehensive, systematic clinical study of what he called the mental illnesses of pregnant women, women who had recently given birth, and women who were nursing. He documented 79 case studies. He analyzed patterns. He wrote with a genuinely clinical and compassionate eye about what he was observing. And he observed it clearly. He saw that childbirth was associated, in a meaningful number of women, with psychiatric disturbances that were real, that were serious, and that deserved medical attention rather than moral judgment. By the late 19th century, diagnoses of puerperal insanity were reportedly responsible for around 10% of asylum admissions of women in the United States. 10%. These were not rare, marginal cases. They were women who had given birth, who had survived the physical ordeal we've been discussing across this entire journey, and who then found themselves committed to institutions. Now, I want to be careful here, because the history of puerperal insanity is not a simple story of heroic recognition followed by compassionate treatment. It is much more complicated than that. The term itself, insanity, already tells you something important about how Christian medicine understood what these women were experiencing, not as an illness that had a physiological component, not as a condition rooted in hormonal disruption, sleep deprivation, isolation, or the genuine and overwhelming demands of new motherhood in a society that offered almost no support structures beyond what a woman's immediate family could provide, but as madness, as a failure of the self, as something that happened to women who were, in some fundamental way, not managing correctly. The Victorian classification of puerperal insanity divided it into stages with the clinical detachment of an entomologist pinning specimens. Insanity of pregnancy, puerperal insanity occurring in the first 6 weeks after birth, and insanity of lactation occurring at any point during nursing. Each stage had its subvarieties: mania, melancholia, sometimes both simultaneously. The descriptions in asylum records from the period are often striking in their clinical precision about behavior, and equally striking in their absence of any apparent curiosity about why. Why this woman? Why this body? Why this life? A woman admitted to an asylum in Yorkshire in 1868 was described in the records as noisy, restless, and incoherent. She would go on to be readmitted following each of her 13 children, 13 times, from 1868 to 1906. Nearly 40 years of repeated crisis, repeated admission. And as far as the historical record shows, no one ever asked the obvious question. What was it about this particular woman's experience of birth that kept bringing her back? And then there is the treatment. which once you understand it, makes the story almost unbearable. The most fashionable approach in the latter half of the 19th century, particularly in America, was called the rest cure. It was developed by a physician named Silas Weir Mitchell, a man of genuine intelligence and real accomplishment in the understanding of nervous diseases, who had done important work treating injured soldiers during the American Civil War. Mitchell's theory was that nervous exhaustion, what he called neurasthenia, was caused by a depletion of the body's nervous force. The treatment was therefore to replenish that force through rest, nutrition, isolation, and the complete cessation of any activity that might strain the nervous system. For women specifically, this meant bed rest for 6 to 8 weeks, isolation from family. No reading, no writing, no painting, no intellectual activity of any kind. A diet designed to increase body weight, milk every 2 hours, cod liver oil, iron supplements, raw beef soup, and crucially, no independence in the matter. The physician's authority was absolute. The woman's own assessment of what she needed, her own understanding of what was helping or harming, was considered irrelevant. In fact, it was considered a symptom. If you disagreed with the rest cure, that was simply evidence that your nervous system was not functioning correctly. In 1886, a woman came to see Silas Weir Mitchell. Her name was Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She had given birth to her daughter the previous year. In her own words, she had since experienced a severe and continuous nervous breakdown, tending to melancholia and beyond. She wrote to Mitchell before their appointment. "Before marriage, I had a very cheerful disposition. Since then, I have scarce known a happy moment. This agony of mind set in with the child's coming. I understand you are the first authority on nervous diseases." Mitchell prescribed the rest cure. Complete bed rest, no writing, no intellect. UL activity. When she was discharged after a month, he gave her specific instructions for her life at home. Live as domestically as possible. Keep her child with her at all times. Lie down for 1 hour after each meal. And the instruction that she would carry with her for the rest of her life like a brand. Never touch pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live. She followed his instructions, and in her own words, she came within 3 months of complete mental ruin. She described a state in which she would sit down to work and immediately want to lie down and immediately want to sit up, crawl about on the floor, weep without cause, she wrote. I would sit blankly, moving my head from one side to the other, to and fro, for hours together. What saved her was rejecting the treatment. She began to write again. She began to work again. She started to move back toward the life of intellectual engagement that Mitchell had told her was the cause of her illness, and she got better. Not instantly, not without difficulty, but she got better. And in 1892, she published a short story. She called it The Yellow Wallpaper. If you have not read it, I want to tell you what it is. It is the first-person account of a woman who has been prescribed the rest cure by her physician husband, following what she herself describes as a slight hysterical tendency. She is confined to a room, a nursery high in the house with barred windows. She is forbidden to write, though she does, secretly, in stolen moments. And the story follows her descent as the room itself becomes her entire world, as the yellow wallpaper with its grotesque, creeping pattern becomes the surface onto which she projects everything she is not allowed to say, until in the final pages she has peeled back the paper entirely, and she is the woman she saw trapped behind it, free, but not in any way that the world will recognize as freedom. Gilman later wrote about why she wrote the story. She said she wanted to reach doctors like Silas Weir Mitchell. She named him specifically in the text, a fictional version of him, and showed them what their treatment was doing to women. She sent a copy to Mitchell himself. He never responded. I have sat with that fact for a long time. He never responded. What I find most striking about this entire history, from puerperal insanity to the rest cure to the yellow wallpaper, is the pattern of inversion that runs through it. The things that were genuinely helping were often the things being taken away. creativity, movement, agency, connection, intellectual engagement, the ability to name and articulate what was happening in one's own body and mind, and the things that were being offered as treatment isolation, passivity, the silencing of self-expression, the authority of the physician's interpretation over the woman's own, were, in many cases, making things worse. We know this now. We know it clearly, with decades of clinical evidence behind us. Postpartum depression, which affects somewhere between 10 and 15% of women after birth, responds to connection, to support, to therapy, to the ability to express rather than suppress. Postpartum psychosis, the more severe and rarer condition affecting roughly 1 in 1,000 new mothers, requires urgent medical intervention. But it is a treatable condition with identifiable biological components. The experiences these women were having were not moral failures. They were not insanity in any meaningful sense of that word. They were the mind's response to the most profound biological. I see occurring in the context of sleep deprivation, hormonal upheaval, social isolation, and in many cases, the complete erasure of the woman's previous sense of self. Now, here is something I want you to think about. We have been on this journey together for a long time. We have walked through ancient birthing rooms and royal chambers, through ergot and barley seeds and forceps and unwashed hands. We have sat with the data and the prayers and the folk wisdom and the paradoxes. And through all of it, one thing has remained constant. The experience of giving birth across all of human history was experienced almost entirely by women, and the understanding, documentation, treatment, and official response to that experience was shaped almost entirely by men. Men who were not in the room, men who wrote the medical texts, men who ran the asylums, men who devised the cures, men who named the conditions with the language of their time, and women who, whether they were holding barley seeds in Egypt or creeping behind yellow wallpaper in 19th century America, were trying to communicate something true about their experience to a world that was perceived, and typically, structurally, often catastrophically bad at listening. That is the thread I keep finding running through everything. Not cruelty exactly, not conspiracy, but a failure of listening, a failure so deep and so systemic that it took centuries to even begin to address. And this raises a question that I think matters very much right now, in this moment, in the world we actually live in. How much of that listening failure has been corrected? How much has not? Because the specific forms have changed, but the underlying structure, the assumption that women's experience of their own bodies requires external validation before it can be trusted, that structure is older than penicillin, older than the forceps, older than the lying-in hospital. It is as old as the first medical text that described a wandering womb, and it is not entirely vanished. That is not a comfortable thought to end on, but I think it is an honest one, and honesty is, in my view, always worth more than comfort. We have one chapter left together in this particular journey. We have been looking backward through the centuries, through the rooms and the rituals and the remedies and the stories. But the story does not end in the past. It ends in the present. And the question of what we have actually learned, what has genuinely changed, and what we have collectively decided to carry forward, is the final room we have to walk through together. We've been moving through centuries together, from the first flickering candles in the birthing room to the asylum corridors of the Victorian era, from barley seeds in the Nile Delta to the yellow wallpaper peeling from the walls of a New England summer house. But there is a part of this story we have not touched yet, a chapter that unfolds not in the ancient past, not in the medieval darkness, but in living memory, within the last 100 years, within the lifetimes of people who are still alive. And it matters, I think, more than any other part of this history, because it is the part that explains where we actually are right now. Let's go to the United States in 1910. At that moment, roughly half of all babies born in the country were delivered by midwives, not hospitals, not obstetricians, midwives. In the southern states, black midwives, called granny midwives, a name that carried both affection and, in some quarters, deliberate condescension, were attending up to 75% of all births. These women were the direct inheritors of a tradition that stretched back centuries across the Atlantic, rooted in the knowledge that enslaved African women had carried with them onto the slave ships, had preserved through generations of community practice in the most impossible circumstances imaginable. They were not marginal figures. They were central to the survival of entire communities. And then something happened in 1910. A report was published. You may know it by the name of the man who wrote it, the Flexner Report. Abraham Flexner was commissioned to evaluate medical education in the United States and Canada. His recommendations were in many respects genuinely important in raising the standards of medical schools. But embedded in those recommendations was a particular vision of who belonged in medicine. Flexner's report advocated for hospital deliveries and recommended the abolition of midwifery. Midwives, in his framing, were primitive, untrained, a relic of a pre-scientific era that a modern nation should leave behind. The report has since been recognized by medical historians for its deeply racist, sexist, and classist assumptions, but at the time it carried massive authority, and it set in motion a campaign that would over the following decades dismantle an entire tradition. In 1915, Dr. Joseph DeLee, one of the most prominent obstetricians in the country, published an extraordinarily revealing paper in the first issue of the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. He argued that pregnancy and childbirth were inherently dangerous and pathological events. He called them, in his own words, evil. His solution was a standardized sequence of medical interventions for every birth: sedation at the onset of labor, forceps for delivery, episiotomy as routine, medications to contract the uterus, all of it performed by an obstetrician in a hospital setting. DeLee's framework and the professional machinery that followed it transformed birth from a physiological event into a medical procedure. And over the following 3 decades, as hospitals multiplied and the campaign against traditional midwifery intensified, the numbers shifted dramatically. By 1935, physicians were attending the majority of births in the country. By 1945, midwife-attended births had dropped to 5%. By 1975, just 50 years ago, less than 1% of births in the United States were attended by midwives. Less than 1%. An entire profession, carrying centuries of accumulated knowledge, effectively erased within a single human lifetime. And here is the detail I cannot set aside when I think about this history. The campaign against traditional midwifery was not driven primarily by evidence that midwives were producing worse outcomes. It was not. In fact, multiple research studies from the early 20th century found that midwife-attended births had lower maternal mortality rates than those attended by general practitioners who had been poorly trained in obstetrics. The midwives were not the problem. The problem, from the perspective of the medical establishment, was something else entirely. The midwives, black midwives, immigrant midwives, indigenous midwives, represented competition. They represented a form of medical authority that existed outside the credentialing systems that physicians controlled. They represented the continuation of a tradition that said, "This knowledge lives in women's hands and women's communities, and it does not require your validation to be real." That was threatening, and so the campaign against them was not framed as a professional turf war. It was framed as public health, as progress, as the march of science. Black granny midwives were described in public health literature as incompetent, unsanitary, dangerous. And the women who said otherwise, the women who knew from their own experience, from their community's experience, that these midwives had been attending births safely for generations, were not consulted in the decisions that were made about them. By the mid-20th century, the erasure was almost complete, and then, in the 1960s and 70s, something began to shift. The women's movement was asking hard questions about who controlled women's bodies and who got to make decisions about women's health. A woman named Ina May Gaskin was doing something extraordinary on a commune in Tennessee called The Farm. She and her colleagues were attending births, hundreds of births, with outcomes that challenged the assumption that hospital obstetrics was inherently safer. She published a book. She talked about birth as a physiological event that in most cases needed support rather than management. She became a figure around whom a new movement began to coalesce. And, in December, that followed, a remarkable set of research findings began to accumulate. Findings that, when you read them with the history we have been discussing in mind, are almost poignant in what they confirm. Let me give you the numbers, because they matter. A meta-analysis of 26 randomized controlled trials from 17 countries, involving more than 15,000 women, examined what happened when women had continuous support during labor from a trained companion, someone not employed by the hospital, not part of the clinical team, simply a person whose entire role was to stay with the laboring woman and provide physical comfort, encouragement, and presence. The results were striking. Women with continuous labor support were 25% less likely to have a cesarean section. With a doula specifically, that reduction was 39%. They were 8% more likely to have a spontaneous vaginal birth, 15% more with a doula. Their labors were shorter by an average of 41 minutes. They were less likely to need pain medication. They were significantly less likely to experience negative feelings about their birth. And here is the detail I keep returning to. There was no evidence of any risks associated with doula support. None. It was, in the language of clinical research, a risk-free intervention that improved outcomes across multiple dimensions. The word doula comes from ancient Greek. It means a woman who serves, a woman who stays. And we now have clinical evidence from thousands of women across 17 countries that having someone who simply stays, who is simply present continuously without a clinical role, makes birth measurably safer. We are rediscovering with randomized controlled trials what the gossips already knew. And this is not the only piece of ancient wisdom that modern research has confirmed. The World Health Organization, in its current guidelines for care during childbirth, specifically recommends warm water immersion during the first stage of labor as a practice that reduces pain without causing harm. Women have been laboring in warm water for as long as there have been women. The WHO recommends freedom of movement during labor, the ability to walk, to shift position, to find the posture that the body wants. Women in traditional birthing rooms were supported upright, helped to move, offer. The birthing stool as an alternative to lying flat on a bed. The WHO recommends that women have a companion of their choosing present during labor. We've discussed what that companion looked like across the centuries. None of this is new. What is new is the peer-reviewed research literature that finally got around to testing it. Now I want to hold two things in tension here, because I think the honest version of this story requires both. On one side, there is the genuine and extraordinary progress that obstetric medicine has made. The sulfonamide antibiotics introduced in the 1930s and 40s that finally made puerperal fever treatable. The availability of blood transfusions for postpartum hemorrhage. The surgical capability to perform cesarean sections safely, both saving women whose labors are obstructed beyond any other solution, and saving infants who would not otherwise survive. The neonatal intensive care units that give premature babies a chance at life that no previous era could have offered. These things are not nothing. They are everything for the women and babies who need them. The transformation from a world where 1 in 18 married women died from childbirth relate. Causes across a lifetime to a world where the risk in Europe today is 1 in 2,400. That transformation is the result of real, hard-won scientific progress. I am not a romantic about the past. The past was often brutal. But on the other side of this tension is something important. In the process of building the modern obstetric system, something was lost, not the knowledge itself. The knowledge was never destroyed. only suppressed. But the structures that held it, the communities that practiced it, the women who carried it, the black granny midwives of the American South, did not disappear because they were inadequate. They were systematically excluded, stigmatized, and legislated out of practice. The traditional birth attendants of indigenous communities around the world did not lose their authority because their knowledge was inferior. They lost it because colonial and post-colonial medical systems imposed different frameworks on communities that had not asked for that imposition. And the women who gave birth in those hospital systems, who were separated from family during labor, who were strapped to beds and monitored by machines and managed by strangers, those women lost something too. Something that had always mattered and that research is now spending considerable effort to quantify. The presence, the continuity, the known face, the hands that had been in the room before. Today, in countries like Sweden, France, and Japan, midwives attend close to 75% of all births. These countries also have some of the lowest maternal and infant mortality rates in the world. The United Kingdom has maintained midwifery as a distinct profession throughout the 20th century. Midwives in Britain attend the majority of normal births. The outcomes are consistently good. In the United States, which moved most aggressively toward physician-attended hospital birth, the statistics tell a different story. The maternal mortality rate in the United States is, by most measures, the highest of any wealthy industrialized nation. Black women in the United States are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women. These disparities are not explained by biology. They are explained in part by the systematic dismantling of the community-based care structures, the midwives, the traditional birth attendants, the granny midwives that had served those communities for generations, and they are being addressed in part by bringing those structures back. Several American states have now expanded Medicaid coverage to include doula care. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has formally recognized continuous labor support as one of the most effective tools available to improve birth outcomes. The wisdom that Semmelweis had to die for, the understanding that the environment in which birth happens and the people who are in the room matter, as much as the technology available, is being reintegrated into mainstream medicine, slowly, imperfectly, with a great deal of bureaucratic resistance, but genuinely. I want to ask you something before we move to our final chapter together. When you think about what this story adds up to, this entire journey from the candlelit room, where Henny Van Don Dam was fined 15 leaves for listening at the staircase, all the way to the clinical trial, showing that doulas reduce cesarean rates by 39%. What do you make of it? Because I find, when I sit with it long enough, that the story is not really about birth, or rather, it is about birth. But birth is the lens through which it shows us something larger, about what happens when specialized knowledge is held by communities that the powerful consider disposable, about what happens when the tools of one era dismiss everything that came before as superstition, about how long it takes, how many generations, how many unnecessary deaths, how many women whose experience was dismissed or ignored or pathologized, for a truth to be formally acknowledged, about what it costs to lose something before you understand what you had, and about what it looks like to try to find your way back. The story of childbirth through history is not a story of ignorance gradually replaced by knowledge. It is more complicated and more honest than that. It is a story of knowledge that was present from the beginning, imperfect, sometimes dangerous, sometimes extraordinarily wise, being claimed, discarded, suppressed, and reclaimed over and over again in different forms, under different names. The gossip sitting with a woman through the night. The midwife who carried the baptism water and the bitter herbs in the same basket. The doula who stays. We have one final room to walk through.
No.
Room from the past, but a room that exists right now. Because everything we have been discussing, the data, the history, the people, and the losses and the recoveries, it all converges on a present moment, On a world where birth is simultaneously safer than it has ever been, and in some communities, more dangerous than it needs to be. On a question that the entire arc of this history seems to be asking us, quietly but insistently. What have we actually learned? What are we going to do with it? We started with a door, a simple wooden door somewhere in a Belgian town 500 years ago, and a man named Henny van den Dam crouching behind a staircase, trying to hear what was happening on the other side. He was fined 15 leuven for listening. Not because what was happening in that room was shameful, but because it was sacred. Because the people inside, the women, the midwife, the gossips, had built a world of their own, a circle of knowledge and presence and care that had survived for thousands of years, and that asked in return only one thing: to be left alone to do what it had always done. We have traveled a long way since that door. We have sat with the barley seeds in Egypt. We have walked through the wandering wombs of ancient Greece. We have stood beside Louise Bourgeois in the palace, as she delivered a future king and whispered wine into the struggling baby's mouth. We have read the records of Semmelweis's numbers, meticulously written and meticulously ignored. We have peeled back the yellow wallpaper with Charlotte Perkins Gilman. We have sat in the silence left behind by the granny midwives of the American South, women whose knowledge was centuries deep and whose erasure took less than a generation. And now we are here, the present moment, the one that all of that history was quietly building toward. Let me show you where we actually stand. In the year 2000, the World Health Organization estimated that 328 women died for every 100,000 live births worldwide. By 2023, that number had fallen to 197, a 40% reduction in just 23 years. The momentum of human attention, properly directed, can move extraordinary distances in a very short time. And at the best end of the spectrum, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Belarus, the numbers are now almost incomprehensibly small. 3 maternal deaths per 100,000 births. 4. To put that in the perspective. Active of everything we've discussed. In 17th century Europe, the rate was somewhere between 100 and 200 per 100,000 births at its peak. In some hospital wards in the 19th century, it was more than 10 times higher than that. The gap between then and now is not just a gap in numbers. It is a gap in the lived experience of what it means to be pregnant, to give birth, to survive. For women in the countries where this progress has been most fully realized, the shadow that sat at the edge of every birthing room across the whole of human history, the shadow that the Romans built an entire pantheon of gods to hold at bay, that medieval women sewed into their birthing girdles, that Semmelweis spent his life and his sanity trying to name and expose that shadow has, to a very large degree, been dispelled. And that is a genuinely extraordinary thing. But I want to be honest with you. As I have tried to be across this entire journey, the story is not finished. Not even close. In 2023, 260,000 women still died from pregnancy-related causes. That is 712 women every single day, 1 every 2 minutes. And the distribution of that burden is not random, not inevitable, not simply a matter of technological access. It maps with devastating precision onto the same fault lines that have always divided the world. In South Sudan, the maternal mortality rate is over 1,200 per 100,000 births. In the United States, the wealthiest country in the history of the world with the most advanced medical technology ever created, it is 21 per 100,000. 21 when Norway is 4, when Finland is 3. And within the United States, that number of 21 conceals something darker still. For black women, the rate is approximately 50 per 100,000 births. Not because black women's bodies are more fragile, not because their pregnancies are inherently more complicated, but because of something we've seen at every turn in this history. The systematic failure to listen to certain women's experiences, to trust certain women's knowledge of their own bodies, to provide certain women the quality of care that human dignity requires, and that evidence consistently shows makes the difference between life and death. The same mechanisms, different century, different names. Here is what I find most striking about the modern picture. The countries with the best maternal outcomes are almost always the countries that never fully dismantled their midwifery systems. Sweden, Norway, Finland, the Netherlands. In Sweden, midwives attend the majority of uncomplicated births. The system integrates medical technology where it is needed and midwifery philosophy as the foundation everywhere. In the Netherlands, a country famous for its high rate of home births attended by midwives, nearly 30% of all births happen at home, significantly higher than most other wealthy nations. Maternal outcomes are among the best in the world, and the United States, which pursued the most aggressive medicalization of birth and the most thorough dismantling of midwifery tradition, sits 62nd on the global list. Not because American medicine is unsophisticated, but because somewhere in the process of building the most technologically advanced birthing system on Earth, certain things were lost. The continuity, the presence, the relationship between a woman and the person who has known her throughout her pregnancy. The understanding, rooted in millennia of accumulated practice, that birth is not primarily a medical crisis waiting to happen. It is a physiological process that, in most cases, needs support, not management. Support. And the evidence, all of it, from the meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials to the comparative health statistics across countries, keeps pointing at the same thing. The women who do best are the women who are known, who are accompanied, who have someone in the room who has been there before, and who will be there the whole time, who are treated not as a patient to be processed, but as a person whose body contains a wisdom of its own that deserves to be heard. The gossips knew this. The midwives knew this. Serenus of Ephesus knew it when he described the ideal midwife as someone who must be calm, fearless, supportive, and sympathetic. He wrote that in the 2nd century of the Common Era, 2,000 years ago. And we are finally, with clinical rigor and academic literature and policy frameworks and Medicaid reimbursement schedules, proving that he was right. I want to offer you one more story before we close the door on this journey. Not a story from the past, a story from the present. In 2017, the United States Surgeon General formally recognized the opioid crisis as a public health emergency. In 2018, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention identified maternal mortality as a public health emergency. And in 2022, buried in the Consolidated Appropriations Act, the kind of legislation that most people never read and fewer people celebrate, Congress allocated funding to expand and train a diverse doula workforce, specifically to address disparities in maternal health outcomes among Black, Indigenous, and rural women. A small thing, perhaps, in the sweep of federal policy. But think about what it actually is. The United States government formally recognizing that the presence of a trusted companion during birth, the most ancient form of care that has ever been offered to a laboring woman, the thing the gossips did in Tudor England, the thing the granny midwives did in the rural South before anyone tried to stop them, is a measurable, evidence-based, cost-effective intervention that saves lives. Not instead of medicine. Alongside it. The circle that opened when Henny van den Dam was barred from that room in 15th century Belgium is beginning, very slowly and very imperfectly, to close. What strikes me most as I sit at the end of this entire story is how consistent the human wisdom around birth has been. Across Egypt and Greece and Rome, across medieval England and Renaissance France and the antebellum American South, across cultures that shared no language, no religion, no political system, no geography. The same understanding keeps emerging, that a woman in labor needs warmth, she needs nourishment, she needs presence, she needs to be known by the person in the room. She needs to not be afraid. She needs to be trusted to know something about what is happening in her own body. These are not complicated requirements. They are not expensive to meet. They require no technology more sophisticated than another human being who stays. And yet, across 500 years of the history we've been exploring together, the forces that organize medical care around birth kept, again and again, moving away from exactly this. Moving toward instruments and protocols and institutional authority and the management of a process that, at its heart, asked only to be accompanied. The women we have met across this journey, Agnodis cutting her hair to study medicine in ancient Athens, Louise Bourgeois giving a struggling infant wine from her own mouth in a crowded palace room, Jane Sharp writing cyst. Double quotes to open her midwifery manual. Charlotte Perkins Gilman taking back her pen in defiance of the man who told her it was making her ill. The unnamed granny midwife who attended her last birth in rural Georgia sometime in the mid-20th century, before the laws made her stop. They were not simply doing a job. They were maintaining something, a continuity of care, a continuity of knowledge, a thread that ran from hand to hand from the very first time one woman crouched in the dark beside another woman in labor and stayed. Some of that thread was cut. And what we are living now is the long, difficult, incomplete work of finding where the ends are and learning to tie them back together. I've been thinking about you as I worked on this story, about whoever you are, wherever you are, right now. Maybe you're in bed with your phone propped on the pillow. Maybe you're on a couch in a house that has gone quiet. Maybe someone is asleep nearby. Or maybe you are alone with the dark and the particular quality of late night, thinking that makes history feel close and alive and relevant in ways it does not always feel during the day. And I genuinely hope, that something in what we've told, cared about tonight has stayed with you. Not the statistics, necessarily, though the statistics matter. Not the names, though the names deserve to be remembered. But the underlying truth that all of this history is trying to tell us. That every human life begins with an act of extraordinary courage on the part of one specific person. That this fact has always deserved more attention, more care, more honest witnessing than the world has consistently been willing to give it. And that the people who showed up in every era, in every culture, in every room, who simply stayed and held the candle and whispered, "You can do this," and tied the threads together after the cutting was done. Those people were doing something that mattered. That matters still. That will matter as long as there are people in the world. Thank you. That is not a small thing to say at the end of a journey like this one. I mean it quite specifically. Thank you for staying, for listening through all of it, the difficult parts and the surprising parts and the occasional moment where ancient medicine got genuinely, spectacularly wrong about geese. You stayed. And that is exactly what this whole story has been about. We started with a door and a man who was fined for listening at a staircase. And we end here, in this room together, on the other side of 500 years of closed doors and opened ones, of knowledge preserved and knowledge lost and knowledge painfully and perfectly recovered, on the other side of every woman who ever went into that room and came back out again, and every woman who did not, but who left behind something that survived her, in the hands of the midwife who remembered, in the book that Jane Sharp wrote to her sisters, in the data that finally told the world what the gossips already knew, in the research that proved with controlled trials across 17 countries that having someone stay makes all the difference. The next story I want to bring you is waiting. I have been thinking about it for weeks, another chapter of human history that we think we understand but do not. Another room full of things we've gotten wrong and right and wrong again. Another set of people whose names deserve to be said aloud. It is coming, and I hope very much that when it arrives, you will be here. Comfortable with the lights low and the world quiet, ready to listen the way you have been right. Sleep well.